This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait.
It was a made-for-TV war.
We did not know how to get Saddam Hussein.
Now, 5 years later, what do you remember?
This looks like what I'd always imagined hell would look like.
And what were you never told?
Probably not a single Scud was intercepted by a Patriot.
Tonight on Frontline, Part 1 of the Gulf War.
Funding for Frontline is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you. This is Frontline.
In the winter of 1991, amid the burning oil wells of Kuwait, two armies faced each other in the desert. At stake were the oil fields of the Middle East and America's leadership in the world. The war in the Persian Gulf would be the first test after the Cold War of the American promise of a new world order.
The Gulf War was an American war. There were Iraqis there, and there were lots of allies in the coalition were there, but it was a U.S. war from start to finish.
For the American military, this would be a war fought on two fronts, against an Iraqi army entrenched in the desert, and against the entrenched ghosts of an old war.
The Persian Gulf War didn't last for 6 weeks. It lasted for 20 years. Vietnam is a poltergeist through this whole thing. It had a psychological dimension as a consequence of Vietnam that transcended Saddam Hussein and the invasion of Kuwait somehow in ways that made this war larger than it really was.
This is the story of what happened when America confronted Saddam Hussein and itself in the Arabian desert. It was in July 1990 when American spy satellites first photographed unusual military movement in the Persian Gulf.
My intelligence officer came in and started to show me satellite photos and other intelligence which suggested an Iraqi buildup in the southern part of Iraq. It wasn't immediately troubling because it was just a buildup within their own country. It did not have the backup that one would expect to see for an invasion of another country. The logistics system was not in place to support an invasion. They had not brought forward artillery. We couldn't see their communications coming up in a way that one would expect to see. And so although it was of interest and troubling, it did not yet become something of great concern.
The U.S. had sided with Saddam Hussein during Iraq's 8-year war with Iran. Now the Iraqi dictator was using his vast oil revenues to build nuclear weapons and equip a 1 million-man army that could dominate the Middle East. But the American government was confident it could contain his ambitions.
One of the basic problems at the outset of the crisis was that the administration was convinced of the rectitude of its policy towards Iraq, which was to extend them credits and to try to build bridges to Iraq to change their behavior. They knew Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator. But the idea, if we build bridges, maybe we can change this fellow's way of doing business. Meanwhile, the intelligence community in the summer of 1990 was watching what Saddam Hussein did and what he said, and they were trying to send this message to their political masters that the Iraqis were serious about moving into Kuwait. But the administration just couldn't conceive that its policy was failing, and therefore they turned a deaf ear to these warnings.
In Washington that summer, President Bush was distracted by a much bigger problem: managing the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War.
The idea that on a Sunday afternoon or something, I was going to stroll into the Oval and go, oh, by the way, Mr. President, Saddam Hussein is going to mass 100,000 plus forces and is going to walk into Kuwait and is going to make this the 19th province of Iraq. And this is going to be the major test of the post-Cold War world. That was too big. It was too dramatic.
2 months earlier, Saddam Hussein had welcomed his neighbor and ally, the Emir of Kuwait. The Emir ruled one of the wealthiest countries on earth. Kuwait owned 1/10 of the world's oil. Iraq was rich in oil too, but Saddam's military spending had pushed his regime to the brink of bankruptcy. Saddam blamed the Emir for his troubles, accusing Kuwait of flooding the market with cheap oil, lowering prices, and hastening Iraq's descent into economic crisis.
We started to realize that there is a conspiracy against Iraq, a deliberate conspiracy against Iraq by Kuwait, organized, devised by the United States.
Later that day, Saddam would issue the Emir a stark warning.
He said, each dollar less in price means to us $1 billion in revenues for a year. If you do not mean waging a war against Iraq, please stop it.
But the Emir took a tough stand, and a month later, Saddam's inner circle decided that unless Kuwait handed over $10 billion to Iraq immediately, they would invade.
Iraq had no choice but to act, either to be destroyed, to be suffocated and strangled inside its territory, or attack the enemy on the outside.
The Republican Guard was ordered to move south toward Iraq's border with Kuwait. These were the Iraqi army's elite divisions, equipped with Soviet tanks. No other Middle Eastern country except Israel had forces to rival them. Soon, 30,000 Iraqi troops had massed on the border between Iraq and Kuwait. With the crisis building, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak rushed to Baghdad, sent by Kuwait and the Arab world to arrange negotiations. Mubarak, one of America's closest allies in the region, was determined to discover Saddam's plans. It was an encounter that would have far-reaching consequences.
I met with Saddam Hussein. He met me in the airport. Then he took me in the car. He was driving, and inside him, nobody with us, until we went to one of the palaces near the lake there. And we went upstairs to the first floor, tete-a-tete, in a big room, and we were both alone, nobody with us. I asked him about what's the problem, what's happening. I told him, do you have any intention to attack them, invade them? He told me, no, but don't tell the Kuwaitis about that. It was a very clear answer.
As soon as he left Baghdad, the Egyptian president telephoned the White House to report that Saddam was bluffing. Mubarak told George Bush that the Iraqi leader was desperate for money, but that the Arabs would sort things out.
Since we didn't know the internal situation in Iraq, nor Saddam Hussein, our best bet was to take counsel from the people who did know him. And what he was really saying is, you know, don't jump in this thing. Just let it work its way out. You got to handle this guy right.
At his headquarters in Tampa, Florida, the American military commander responsible for the Middle East was following the diplomatic developments.
Every elder statesman in the world who was an Arabist was saying, oh, this will never happen. You know, an Arab will never invade another Arab. This is all a show of force on Saddam's part, and that the Kuwaitis will cave and grant him the concessions that he was looking for, and he won't have to do this invasion.
The day after Mubarak's visit, Saddam abruptly summoned the American ambassador, April Glaspie.
And in essence, what Saddam Hussein was doing was feeling her out as to what the American position would be if the Iraqis moved against the Kuwaitis. And the response that he got was a very satisfactory one.
Glaspie repeated for Saddam the State Department's position.
This was hardly tantamount to a warning shot across the bow. She said, we're watching you, we're concerned about the bellicose statements that you've been issuing, but our fundamental feeling is that we have no direct vested interest in Arab-Arab disputes, including the dispute that you're having with the Kuwaitis over the mutual border that you share.
As the meeting ended, Saddam announced there would be more talks with the Kuwaitis. And Glaspie cabled Washington. Saddam is worried. I believe we would now be well advised to ease off on public criticism of Iraq until we see how negotiations develop. The cable reached the president's Middle East advisor at a critical moment.
I had actually written a memo to the president saying, we're getting all this intelligence, obviously concerned, when suddenly the cable from April Glaspie came. And what I did was I scribbled on the top of the memo, what I've written you may be a little bit OBE, overtaken by events, Mr. President, because things look a little bit calmer now. April's just come in with the cable, essentially saying, I think this situation's going to wind down. We Americans need to sit tight and not overreact. I think by the time George Bush went back to the residence on July 25th, the general sense was a crisis that, while probably not past, had largely peaked, and that it was on its way to getting resolved.
But the Iraqi threat was still building on the Kuwaiti border. The original 30,000 troops grew to 70,000, then 100,000. Arab leaders continued to insist it was all a bluff. Then on August 1st, the Iraqis walked out on talks when the Kuwaitis refused to meet their demands. Saddam issued his orders.
We
gathered at 4 o'clock on the afternoon before the invasion. And on a map table, we were shown our objectives in Kuwait. Our captain explained the Kuwaiti government was about to change. We had been asked to help set up the new government.
During the crisis, Major General Wafiq al-Samarrai held a key position in Iraqi military intelligence. He says he met with Saddam Hussein nearly every day and remembers Saddam's final calculations about what America would do.
Saddam thought any reprisals would be limited and would tail off with time. He thought that America's involvement in Vietnam had badly damaged its willingness to use military power. Vietnam had been an outright defeat, militarily and politically.
As they spoke, a satellite took this photograph. American intelligence analysts searched for the bases which had been crammed with hundreds of Iraqi tanks, but when they found them, they were empty. The Republican Guard was on the move. More photographs arrived showing assault helicopters at Iraqi airfields within striking range of Kuwait. U.S. Defense Intelligence issued its highest alert, WatchCon 1.
Schwarzkopf came up to the meeting place of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the 1st of August. And it was in that meeting that it all sort of clicked for me that this could no longer be just a feint or a demonstration, but it was a serious, serious threat to Kuwait.
I explained to them that I was quite sure that this was a plan. I couldn't guarantee them that they were going to invade, but I felt that all the indications were there that they were going to invade.
As I walked out of that meeting with Secretary Cheney, I said, Dick, this cannot be just a feint, and we've got to try to get some kind of message off immediately.
I was essentially deputized to go back to the White House, to meet with Scowcroft and the president, and to convince them to take one last shot at trying to influence Saddam. And just as we were talking about what exactly he would say to Saddam in this last effort to get him to think twice before doing anything, that's when the phone rang, saying, "We just heard from our people in Kuwait, shooting has started, this war, whatever it is, has begun."
Well, on that morning, I was woken up by a large explosion, and I looked out the window, and there's the tower, all in a pall of smoke. I thought, hello, hello, we've got a problem going on here.
Republican Guard tanks sealed off the city, while Iraqi special forces seized government buildings. The advancing Iraqis met little resistance. The emir had stood down his army to avoid provoking Saddam. Many of his soldiers were taking their summer vacations.
I received a call from a friend in the foreign ministry, and he told me that the foreign minister said that now, and stressed now, is the time for the U.S. to act. And I said to him, there may have been a time to act yesterday, there may be a time to act in the future, but I don't know what we can do right now.
For us, it was shocking. Shocking. I couldn't believe that this could happen in the Arab world. Saddam Hussein, we were very in good terms, and he was a friend. We know each other very well, but didn't expect him to do that.
By noon, Saddam Hussein controlled 1/5 of the world's oil.
Saddam probably figured the Arab world and the world at large would bitch and moan for a couple of days, and then people would get used to it. And the world would essentially learn to live with it. And the United States, which had left Lebanon a decade before and so forth, was not going to do anything. And even if the United States wanted to do something, the local Arabs would never do anything. They would never work with the United States and stand up to Saddam. So I think Saddam took the pretty intelligent decision that he could probably get away with it.
President, yeah, Helen.
Do you contemplate intervention as one of your options?
We're not discussing intervention. I would not discuss any military options, even if we'd agreed upon them. But one of the things...
The president summoned his National Security Council to confront the crisis. But Bush's confused statement to the press set the tone for the subsequent meeting. It was rambling and inconclusive.
And
we really needed some time to come to grips with this basic fundamental question of our strategic assessment of what this meant. Did it matter that he'd taken Kuwait?
The notion of Iraq, which was an oil powerhouse in itself, acquiring the Kuwaiti resources, and thus perhaps being able to dominate OPEC, was a tremendous danger to the United States and to the industrialized world. I thought it made a lot of difference.
To put it bluntly, what we ultimately did, sending 500,000 people around the world and all that entailed, that was too big of a thought for people at that first meeting even to think about. So instead, you had people talking all over the place, many of whom were talking about how we could live with this.
The president left to give a speech in Aspen. Brent Scowcroft traveled with him.
The president was way out in front of most of his advisors. He felt the same way I did about it, about the sort of resigned tone of the meeting, and that there was no sense of outrage or no sense of imperative.
Waiting in Aspen for the president was the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. The victor in the Falklands was already thinking about war.
George Bush just said to me, Margaret, what is your view? And so indeed I told him that aggressors must be stopped. Not only stopped, but they must be thrown out. An aggressor cannot gain from his aggression. He must be thrown out. And really, by that time in my mind, I thought we ought to throw him out so decisively that he could never think of doing it again.
It was like two soulmates finding each other. They found from the very first words that they were exactly on the same wavelength, that this was a tremendously serious event, that it could not be tolerated, and something had to be done.
The president said little to the press, but he was already thinking about military action. Thatcher remembers telling him Saddam was a potential Hitler who must be stopped. Both leaders drew their history lessons from World War II.
Don't forget, George Bush fought bravely in the last war. He knew what it was like to fight. He was injured. So he knew that if you didn't turn out an aggressor, then you could have simply terrible consequences for future generations.
George Bush had been formed by his experiences as a young Navy pilot in the Pacific. But for his generals, the last war was Vietnam, where Norman Schwarzkopf and Colin Powell had served as young officers. And 20 years later, the military and the country were still traumatized by the disaster in Vietnam. As the president returned to Washington, the political challenge that faced him was enormous. To throw Saddam out of Kuwait, he would have to overcome stiff resistance inside his own government and in the country. But now, as the president headed for a meeting with his key advisors, there was fresh intelligence that the Iraqis might be headed for Saudi Arabia.
Well, one of the first questions was, is he going to stop at the borders of Kuwait? Saddam, is he going to stop there? Or is he likely to go on into Saudi Arabia and move down to the oil fields?
We had no idea what he was going to do. Everybody'd been dead wrong with respect to the question of whether or not he was going to invade Kuwait, and he'd invaded Kuwait, and you had 140,000 Iraqi troops on the Saudi border.
The key decision that came out of that meeting is, we will defend Saudi Arabia. There was no debate about that. The question I then posed is, then what? Are we prepared, should we be prepared to go forward and fight for Kuwait?
The president gave no response to Powell's question that night or the next day at Camp David. Vietnam was at the table, the old fear of another escalating conflict with no clear end.
For those of us who are Vietnam veterans, we all have a view that says, if you're going to put us into something, then you owe the armed forces, you owe the American people a clear statement of what political objective you're trying to achieve.
Initially, anyway, General Powell was not as concerned about the crisis as I was. He, in fact, was more of an advocate of sanctions as opposed to military force. The senior military leadership understands better than anybody else that if, in fact, you're going to use military force, you're going to suffer casualties. It's almost impossible not to, and it's their people that are hurt in the process.
At Camp David, the military briefed the president on its plan to defend Saudi Arabia.
The bottom line I was trying to make to the president is that this is the force that was necessary to guarantee a defense of Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf oil fields. It was not an offensive force by any means. The force would have to be considerably bigger if we were going to eject the Iraqis out of Kuwait by force of arms.
After the meeting, while Brent Scowcroft stayed on with the president to figure out how to persuade the Saudis to accept American troops, Colin Powell left for Washington.
I don't recall anybody saying, we're going to go take back Kuwait. I recall everybody saying we are going to clearly do whatever is necessary to defend Saudi Arabia.
The next afternoon, Bush returned to Washington. The generals hoped the talk of liberating Kuwait had gone away. It wasn't the last time they would misread George Bush.
He motioned me to come out, so I went out there, and he said, what's going on, what have we heard? And what I essentially reported was that there had been zero progress. He was pretty fired up. Even before I spoke to him, I think I probably added 10%, but he was pretty much there to begin with. And then he went off, and the "this will not stand" line was not mine. That was his. And that was just his speaking from where he was.
This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait.
I'm home watching this on television, and that was the first direct expression from the president that he has crossed the line. And there's no question he will do what is necessary to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait, whether it's by sanctions, sanctions in force, force alone, whatever it's going to take. And so he had crossed the river at that point in my mind. And I sat up and said, wow.
I've got to go. I have to go to work. I got to go to work.
I liked it. I liked it very much. Others, Colin Powell says, that'll teach us to leave you up at Camp David alone with him.
Satellites now showed 2 Iraqi divisions near the Saudi border. The CIA reported the Saudis were considering buying Saddam off. If the Iraqis captured Saudi Arabia's ports, Saddam would control 40% of the world's oil. The president dispatched Defense Secretary Dick Cheney to Saudi Arabia. Cheney and his high-level delegation had to convince the Saudi rulers, who had never allowed U.S. troops on their soil, that they could soon become another Kuwait.
I told King Fahd that they did not have the luxury of waiting until Saddam began an invasion of Saudi Arabia and then asked for our help, because then it would be too late.
When Norm Schwarzkopf started laying out what we were prepared to send to Saudi Arabia, beginning with 200,000 troops, I just had the sense that Fahd was absolutely stunned.
At the end of that discussion, the king turned and said, okay. And I almost fell out of my chair, because I absolutely was sitting there thinking, well, you know, this is going to be, thank you very much for the information, we'll let you know. And the king said, okay. And I think we all did a double take and went back and said, you know, Secretary Cheney said, so you agree? And the king said, yes, I agree. We walked out of the meeting, and I said to Secretary Cheney, I said, sir, I'm prepared to start the flow now. Do you want me to do that? And Secretary Cheney said, yes. And so I turned to Chuck and I said, Chuck, send them on their way.
It would be the largest military deployment since Vietnam, more than 250,000 U.S. troops. The president emphasized the buildup was wholly defensive.
To assume Iraq will not attack again would be unwise and unrealistic. If history teaches us anything, it is that we must resist aggression or it will destroy our freedoms. Appeasement does not work. As was the case in the 1930s, we see in Saddam Hussein an aggressive dictator threatening his neighbors.
The first American aircraft refueled above the Saudi desert. Saddam Hussein had never expected to see forces from America, the great ally of Israel, operating from Arab soil. But the invasion had turned both Western and Arab governments against Iraq. Soon, British, French, and Egyptian troops arrived, the beginnings of a coalition of 30 countries. Saddam struck back, rounding up foreigners in Kuwait as hostages. He hoped to intimidate the West. But his chilling encounter with 7-year-old Stuart Lockwood had the opposite effect.
Does Stuart get his milk? Yes, he does.
He patted me on the head and ruffled my hair. I was scared because of the soldiers.
Are you getting your milk, Stuart?
My throat was going all shivering and all that. And I goes, oh, no, it's going to get me, something like that. You're going to put me in this room forever with my mum and dad and my brother. I felt really nervous.
He was a man who miscalculated in taking hostages, and then compounded his miscalculation and made Schwarzkopf's military efforts much easier by letting them go in December. Every time he had to make a major strategic decision, Saddam guessed wrong.
The UN imposed sanctions and called on Saddam to withdraw from Kuwait. Instead, he sent in over 300,000 soldiers. Kuwait's wealth was systematically plundered. Some Kuwaitis tried to fight back, but the resistance was soon broken. Saddam ruled Kuwait as he'd always ruled Iraq, with torture and terror. But this time, the United States was no longer turning a blind eye, and Saddam's methods allowed President Bush to elevate the struggle to a moral crusade.
Summary executions, routine torture, Hitler revisited. America will not stand aside. The world will not allow the strong to swallow up the weak.
By the time Saddam paid his first visit to Kuwait, Bush had authorized the CIA to start recruiting Iraqi dissidents to overthrow him. The U.S. Army's Delta Force was on standby to go into Iraq and kidnap him, but Saddam's security was too tight.
We did try to target Saddam Hussein. He was a very difficult target. Saddam Hussein moved around a lot. He had a lot of different locations. When you're going to conduct an operation to go in and capture someone, you need a lot of detailed intelligence, and you've got to know what it is you're going about. You certainly have to think of the downside of it, is can I do that, and if I can't, do I want to end up with 20 or 30 dead Americans or 50 captured?
President Bush had isolated Saddam diplomatically. He met Mikhail Gorbachev to ask the Soviet Union not to stand in the way if America went to war with Iraq. Iraq was an old ally of the Soviet Union, but Gorbachev agreed. The Cold War had just ended. Gorbachev did not want to risk his new relationship with America.
Very good. Thank you.
This was a key meeting. A country had been occupied. If at that point in history we had not been able to deal with that situation, everything else we had worked for would have been null and void.
Without the Soviet Union on board, we never would have been able to marshal the international coalition that we were able to build up. It just gave a completely different dynamic to the whole effort. Instead of being an effort, let's say, by the United States and the United Kingdom to eject Iraq from Kuwait, it was an effort by the entire international community.
Baker and Bush had methodically built a broad international coalition to oppose Saddam. Ultimately, Bush would convince over 30 nations to contribute financial or military support to the effort.
This is U.S. Navy Warship, Channel 14. Can you tell us what country your flag does under and your port of registry, over?
In the Persian Gulf, a multinational naval force had cut off Iraqi shipping, enforcing the stiff United Nations economic sanctions. But the CIA was telling President Bush it could take years for sanctions to drive Saddam from Kuwait. And inside the American government, there was a growing split over whether sanctions alone could work.
My thinking was that it would be great if sanctions would do the job, because then we would avoid a war with unknown consequences. And therefore, we should give sanctions as much of a ride as was politically possible.
Powell went to see the president. He feared that Bush might rush to war because his civilian advisors had not properly explained how long-term sanctions might work.
I laid out for him what a sanctions policy might look like and how it would work. He listened intently in that way he has, somewhat slouched in his chair with his chin slightly down. And his response was, well, Colin, that's all very, very interesting. It's good to consider all options, but I just don't think we're going to have time for sanctions to work.
Even after this meeting, Colin Powell would continue to argue against the president's line. 2 weeks later in the Pentagon, Powell spoke with a top British commander.
Colin Powell said to me that he would be prepared to give sanctions a considerable time to work. And I said, well, how long are we talking about? To my astonishment, Colin Powell said, well, I would give them up to 2 years to work. He said, I don't think we should mount a military operation for at least that length of time, if that's what it takes for the sanctions to work, which he was confident that they would.
Would you have given the sanctions 2 years?
I don't know. At that point, when we were talking about this on the 24th of September, sanctions had only been at work for about a month, a little over a month. It wasn't clear whether they would have a desired effect. I was prepared to wait and see.
The president and his generals were on a collision course. In the Saudi desert, Schwarzkopf now commanded over 200,000 U.S. and coalition troops. In early October, Bush asked for an immediate briefing on how the military planned to throw Saddam out of Kuwait. But Schwarzkopf believed he didn't have a large enough force. The Iraqis outnumbered him at least 2 to 1.
God, they're great, aren't they?
Colin called me and said, I want you to send an offensive option back. And I objected strongly. I said, look, I've told everybody all along we do not have the forces on the ground to conduct an offensive option.
My view was, well, that's all right, it's a work in progress. Bring it back to the United States. Let us brief it, and we'll all see where we are.
3 days later, Schwarzkopf's chief planner, Colonel Joe Purvis, flew to Washington to brief the president and his aides. To Purvis, it was obvious the best option was to outflank the Iraqi defenses. But he and Schwarzkopf believed they only had enough troops to attack head-on. The computers predicted 10,000 casualties.
When I put up the view graph that had the graphics on it showing the military operation, the arrow pointing straight into Kuwait from Saudi Arabia, General Scowcroft immediately responded by that that didn't look right to him. Asked, why are you attacking into the strength of the Iraqi defense?
My first question is, why don't you go around to the west? And the answer was, well, we don't have enough gas trucks. We'll run out of gas when we're up there on the shoulder. We can't do that. It's not a feasible option. And maybe something, we don't know what kind of sand there is or something, but I was pretty appalled.
The military were saying, here's the way we'd have to do it in a manner that would suggest extraordinary number of casualties and a large price to pay.
This was an effort, however conscious or unconscious, to basically say, this is going to be a near-run thing, and the casualties are going to be very high, and maybe we ought not do this. I think that there was very little enthusiasm in the American military for, in fact, throwing Saddam out of Kuwait militarily.
I wasn't trying to frighten them. I wanted to make sure they understood the significance of the operation we were thinking about. This wasn't going to be just a simple walk in the woods, drop a few bombs, and they'll all go home, the way the Egyptians and the Saudis and the Turks were telling my political colleagues. And these were all gentlemen who had never really been in a major war. And so what I was trying to do is make sure they understood what we were doing and the difficulties of what we were doing, especially when it came to a ground plan. And I think the ground plan is what scared them all to death.
That night, there was a crisis of confidence at the heart of the administration. The White House team wondered if the right generals were in command.
And I went immediately to Cheney and said, this can't happen. If this is what we're going to get, then we'll just have to find a different way to do the military planning.
I shared Brent's concern, and I wanted to send a message through the organization that said, guys, we mean business. Now, one way or another, we're going to get an option put together that allows us to launch offensive action to go after the Iraqis.
What I told them was, don't panic. This is a solvable problem, and we will come up with a plan that you will find workable.
Powell rushed to Saudi Arabia to meet with Schwarzkopf. They knew that back in Washington, Dick Cheney was forming his own Pentagon team to develop a war plan. In Riyadh, Schwarzkopf laid out for Powell the additional forces he would need if the president wanted war.
When Colin came over for his briefing, I pointed out all of my trepidations, and the conclusion of that was Colin said, okay, if you are going to be required to attack, you will have the forces that you need. That was very reassuring to me.
Powell returned to the White House with a new plan.
So, Mr. President, if you direct us to attack in order to eject the Iraqi army out of Kuwait, this is how we're going to do it.
They asked for the 7th Corps, the 2 heaviest divisions in the American Army out of Europe, which totally weakened NATO. They asked for 6 carrier battle groups. And then the political poison pill, they asked for the activation of the National Guard and the Army Reserves. The force represented in these 3 requests was just awesome, overwhelming, not to mention the cost. The president pushed his chair back, said, you've got it, and if you need more, come see me.
Bush made that commitment in secret just days before the congressional elections.
So the decision was made in the White House, not surprisingly, I think in retrospect, although somewhat duplicitously, that the decision would not be announced until after the election. A belief that you didn't want to complicate matters by making it even more of a political issue than it already was.
2 days after the election, 250,000 more troops began heading for the Gulf.
I have today directed the Secretary of Defense to increase the size of U.S. forces committed to Desert Shield to ensure that the coalition has an adequate offensive military option should that be necessary to achieve our common goals.
Bush had taken his generals to the brink of war. Now he had to bring along the American public. Saddam Hussein believed the trauma of Vietnam meant that the American people would not stand for a war. Now the polls showed support for Bush's handling of the crisis was slipping.
Sanctions working doesn't mean just destruction of the Iraqi economy. It means getting Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait.
Secretary General Powell will be back here.
An angry Democratic Congress convened hearings to grill the administration on its plans for war.
That not offer us our best prospect to succeed.
If the president were to ask me today, can you guarantee that these sanctions will work within a year or two? The answer is no, I cannot.
The point is, it's going to be bloody. There are going to be thousands and thousands and thousands of casualties.
States are some kind of consideration.
Some of the sharpest criticism came from the defense establishment, especially from the man who had planned the war in Vietnam.
Surely we should be prepared to extend the sanctions over a 12 or 18-month period if that offers an opportunity to achieve our political objective without the loss of American lives. Who can doubt that a year of blockade will be cheaper than a week of war?
It would be a sad commentary if Saddam Hussein, a 2-bit tyrant who sits on 17 million people and possesses a gross national product of $40 billion, proved to be more patient than the United States, the world's most affluent and powerful nation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Admiral Crowell. These are 2 of the most powerful statements I've heard before this committee in my 18 years here, and I think you rendered a real service and given us a great deal to think about.
This administration had to build up a certain amount of support for the administration's position, and they drew in all sorts of people to talk about the aggression of the Iraqis and how horrible they were, the same sort of thing that we saw in every previous war. And they weren't too careful about checking the credentials and the credibility of the people that they were enlisting.
No one lobbied Congress harder than the Kuwaitis, who spent $10 million on a campaign that centered on Iraqi atrocities. The Congressional Human Rights Caucus convened a special hearing to look into the abuses and heard from a host of witnesses presented by the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S.
They tortured him, they abused him, and after 10 days of torture, they brought him to his parents' home, called out all of the family members, the neighbors, and shot him dead in front of his mother.
I stayed behind and wanted to do something for my country.
But the most compelling testimony came from an anonymous 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl.
Volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital.
She said she witnessed firsthand Iraqi soldiers removing Kuwaiti babies from hospital incubators
Other women were.
and then stealing the incubators.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
We have never heard, in all this time, in all circumstances, a record of inhumanity and brutality and sadism as the ones that the witnesses have given us today.
Only later was it discovered that the girl was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, and that there were doubts about whether she had actually seen the events she described.
Scores of hearings.
I have to ask why she was not identified as your daughter when she gave that testimony to the House Committee, or the House Caucus.
Well, for security reasons, I didn't believe it was just for her safety.
Did the Human Rights Caucus members and the chair people know who she was?
Yes, of course
they knew her identity.
They knew her identity, and they knew exactly what the girl was telling them was the truth.
How many people knew that she was the ambassador's daughter?
I didn't. I don't know who knew. I did not know she was the ambassador's daughter.
Now, I don't know the truth of the story, but it certainly undermined her credibility, and in a certain sense, undermined the credibility of the administration.
22 premature babies. They all died, and then they shot the hospital employees.
George Bush rose up in righteous anger and called this aggression a la the Nazi era.
The fight is about naked aggression.
The American people didn't quite understand that. Then the next argument was that the war was about oil, we had to protect oil.
If control of the world's great oil reserves fell into the hands of that one man, Saddam Hussein.
The banners came out in Harvard Square, hell no, we won't go, we won't die for Texaco. That really didn't resonate. And then if you recall, Jim Baker got up there and said, it's about jobs, jobs, jobs.
If you want to sum it up in one word, it's jobs.
The American people said, what's this all about?
I'm deeply concerned about Saddam's efforts to acquire nuclear weapons.
And then the final thing in which capped the demonization of Saddam Hussein was the announcement that Saddam Hussein was secretly working on weapons of mass destruction, chemicals, biologicals, and most of all, nuclear weapons.
And that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with Hitler revisited, a totalitarianism and a brutality that is naked and unprecedented in modern times. And that must not stand. We cannot talk about...
When you demonize an enemy, such as the president tended to do with Saddam Hussein, you raise expectations that you would do something about him at the end of the day. We did not know how to get Saddam Hussein. This is a man who has survived for 3 decades by nobody knowing how to get him. And so by demonizing him, which was a useful way to raise public interest and support of what we were doing, we also faced the problem of if he was still there at the end of it, which he most likely would be, it would take some shine off the achievement.
The Bush administration was having much more success building up international support for war. Their maneuvering led to a historic UN vote authorizing the use of force in 6 weeks if Iraq refused to leave Kuwait.
Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/21969, please raise their hand.
There were various concessions made to different countries whose support was critical. Egypt was forgiven $7 billion in various debts. Syria was forgiven many of the same sins of which Saddam was accused. Turkey was basically granted China, certain trade concessions Colombia, in return for their Cuba, very important support.
Ethiopia. The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 678, 1990. We have taken political, economic, and military measures to quarantine Iraq and to contain its aggression. The nations of the world have not stood idly by.
But the UN resolution only deepened the fears of the American people.
There was very little public support in the United States for the idea of going to war in the Persian Gulf. In fact, it was overwhelmingly opposed. If we were going to fight a war, we had to do so with the support of the American people, if possible with the support of the American Congress. But that if we were going to send people, Americans, off to die in the Persian Gulf, we had to be able to survive the judgments of history, that we didn't do so precipitously.
To go the extra mile for peace, I will issue an invitation to Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz to come to Washington. In addition, I'm asking Secretary Jim Baker to go to Baghdad to see Saddam Hussein.
Just 6 days before the UN deadline for war, and after many changes of plan, James Baker prepared to meet Tariq Aziz. The Bush administration needed the talks to win over public opinion and a hostile Congress. But they feared the Iraqis might offer a deal that would split the coalition.
If there is a genuine, sincere, serious intention to make peace in the whole region of the Middle East, we are ready to reciprocate. When I went to meet with James Baker, I hadn't the slightest idea that that meeting would succeed. I knew that that was public relations, that he wanted to tell the Congress, look, to the end I tried to find a diplomatic settlement so that he could get few more votes.
Mr. Aziz, does Saddam want that war?
Baker carried a letter from President Bush to the Iraqi leader demanding withdrawal and reminding Saddam America had nuclear weapons.
The president's letter to Saddam Hussein, which Tariq Aziz read in Geneva, made it very clear that if Iraq used weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, against United States forces, that the American people would demand vengeance, and that we had the means to achieve it.
I read it very carefully. And then when I ended reading it, I told him, look, Mr. Secretary, this is not the kind of correspondence between two heads of state. This is a letter of threat, and I cannot receive from you a letter of threat to my president, and I returned it to him.
The president's team could only wait. Had they given Saddam a chance to escape?
We basically said, what if Saddam proposes this? What if he proposes a partial pullback? What if he actually does a partial pullback and promises a complete pullback? What we did was we must have gamed out 10 different Iraqi scenarios that we thought would test the coalition.
And I could never figure out why he didn't do it. He could have just given us fits. And that was what I was worried about happening as a result of a meeting like this.
But in Geneva, Tariq Aziz had offered no last-minute compromise. Instead, the talk had turned to war.
I said that they should not make the mistake of assuming that they would control the terms of the battle, as perhaps they might have assumed in their war with Iran, that this would be a totally different situation, that our technological superiority was overwhelming and would be brought to bear.
My response was very cool. I told him, Mr. Secretary, Iraq is a very ancient nation. We have lived for 6,000 years. I have no doubts that you are a very powerful nation. I have no doubts that you have a very strong military machine, and you will inflict on us heavy losses, but Iraq will survive. And this leadership will decide the future of Iraq.
And I was certain at the time that we would be going to war, and going to war very, very soon. Regrettably, ladies and gentlemen, in over 6 hours, I heard nothing that suggested to me any Iraqi flexibility whatsoever.
Even to this day, I am stunned by Saddam's failure to exploit all of his options. Time and time again, Saddam, by opting for the maximum, actually made it relatively, I hate to use the word easy, but made it much less difficult on the United States and the coalition to sustain itself. And, you know, I'm not sure at times so much whether we won it, but clearly he lost it.
Congress debated whether to give the president the authority to go to war. The House was supporting Bush, but the Senate vote would be close.
But this is the truth. I could not accept the loss of life of any of our children in the Persian Gulf right now, and that tells me that in my gut, I do not believe that it's time to go to war.
I see no compelling reason to rush to military action. Of course, there are no guarantees on economic sanctions. There are also no guarantees on war. Where are the guarantees on war?
It is not an option for the Congress of the United States to disapprove what we for months have asked others to support. It is unthinkable that our government would now lose its will.
On this vote, the yeas are 52 and the nays are 47.
We would not have won the vote without Geneva. We simply wouldn't. In the aftermath of the Geneva meeting, opposition to our use of force eroded. So it was an idea that germinated with the president. It was the right idea. We did it right, and there really should be no second thoughts about that. It worked exactly the way it should have worked.
In the beginning, George Bush had been almost alone in his determination to turn back the invasion of Kuwait. 5 months later, the man often derided as a political wimp had maneuvered his generals, his country, and most of the world to join his stand in the desert.
The president, privately, with the most inner circle, made absolutely clear he was going to go forward with this action, even if he were impeached. The truth of the matter is that while public opinion and the voice of Congress was important to Bush, I believe it had no impact on his decision about what he would do. He was going to throw that son of a bitch out of Kuwait regardless of whether the Congress or the public supported him.
In the final hours before the UN deadline, Saddam appeared on television to assure the Iraqi people victory would be theirs. You are the new leader of the Arab world, he was told. The Americans, said Saddam, rely too much on technology. They never fight man to man. They can never win the battle. Across America, midnight vigils marked the passing of the deadline. At dawn, the president signed the order that would take America and the coalition to war.
He was ordering people into situations where they would lose their lives, and the kind of magnitude of that awful decision, I think, haunted him. You know, how much is a life worth? How much is 100 lives worth? 1,000, 10,000.
In the Gulf, 1,700 coalition aircraft now prepared to attack. They faced modern Iraqi fighters, many built by the French and Soviets, hundreds of missile batteries, and thousands of anti-aircraft guns. At one stage, Pentagon estimates suggested 1 in 5 aircraft in the first attack might be shot down.
We were filled with uncertainty. Our press had been telling us that our generals couldn't general, that our technology didn't work, and our young people were no good. Now, we didn't believe it, but we worried about it because it was sort of imbued in our whole national psyche. Vietnam was a ghost we carried with us.
The air planners' first targets were not the 400,000 Iraqi troops in and around Kuwait, but key strategic political and military targets in Baghdad and all over Iraq. Some hoped that for the first time in history, air power alone would bring victory.
I thought the strategic campaign would not only work, but that it would be bordering on unbelievably successful. And that was based on the fact that technology had finally caught up with the vision that we'd always had of how to apply a strategic air campaign.
Imagine Iraq like a human body. What happens if you take away somebody's ability to think, somebody's ability to communicate with the rest of the body? What happens if you sever their spinal cord? They can't function, right?
Before the planes could attack, Task Force Normandy would fire the first shots of the war. Its Apache gunships had been training for months. Their mission was vital, to destroy at all costs 2 Iraqi radar sites that would otherwise give Baghdad an early warning of what was to come. It was a moonless night. 8 Apaches armed with Hellfire missiles took off towards Iraq. This is a pilot's eye view, videotape from one helicopter's night vision camera. The gunships flew just a few feet off the desert until they were 8 miles from the radar dishes.
We slowed our airspeed to about 40 knots, came up on line, all abreast, so we're all at the same distance from the target. And at this point, I'm not looking through my goggles, I'm looking at a TV screen right in front of me. Watched the clock tick to 0. I gave the code word, get some. At that point, everybody fired their Hellfires.
Get some. Second missile.
From a range of 4 miles, each crew aimed a laser beam that guided their missiles. The Iraqis had anti-aircraft guns, but could not see or hear the helicopters. This was a new kind of war.
Roger that. They're still in air. Okay. Hit that one, slide on the left. Hit that one. Okay.
With the initial blast of the Hellfire, then we really saw some activity in the target.
You're lined up. Firing. I see people running around now. All right. Hold her steady. Got it. Stay with it. There it goes.
I select my gun. I've got very bright flashes of light to my left and right as the Hellfires are leaving. People running around in the site, and underneath my goggles I can see the explosions. My wingman firing is 30 millimeter, the muzzle flashes from that.
Okay, did you get the
Out of the probably 150 people that we were briefed were at the site, I would imagine not more than 10 or 20 probably lived through that engagement.
Within 5 minutes of the time that the first aircraft were scheduled to hit their targets, General Schwarzkopf came in. The door opened. His senior military assistant announced the Commander-in-Chief of United States Central Command. And he burst through the door and took his place at the table.
And then I asked the chaplain to say a prayer,
And then I played God Bless the USA, a blatantly chauvinistic piece of music, but I think it... Planes were in the air at that time, heading towards their targets, with no guarantees of the outcome, to know that we had taken a very big step and that the war had started and none of us knew exactly how it was going to end. It's a very, very emotional moment.
Time is on. 1 minute, sir.
In the Gulf, the Navy prepared to launch dozens of cruise missiles. But the missiles' guidance systems couldn't navigate over the flat desert of Iraq. They needed landmarks to lock onto. So they were secretly programmed to fly over the mountains of Iran and then turn towards Baghdad. The Iranians were told nothing, and no one knew exactly what would happen.
4, 3, 2, 1, launch.
Downtown Tehran would not have been a good mission. We were dealing with neighboring countries who we didn't want to join into the fray. We'd never used them in conflict before, and there was a lot of apprehension about, do we launch these things and then they make up their own mind where they're going?
By 2:25 in the morning, I was tired, sitting in the CNN workspace. I had an Englishman engineer, and I was sort of telling him, you know, it was a bust, we'd have to wait for another night. And then he started to hear, he claimed, dogs barking. And my hearing is not so good as the result of being in Vietnam for many years, but I too started to hear dogs barking. And he said, that has to be a signal. And I laughed and I said, dog radar? Come on. And 10 seconds after I'd made that memorable statement, the sound of anti-aircraft fire started.
Ten stealth bombers were just minutes away from downtown Baghdad. The stealth was designed to be invisible to radar, but to be safe, the Air Force started jamming Baghdad's radar defenses. The jamming gave the game away. The Iraqi radars were blinded, but 3,000 anti-aircraft guns and 60 missile batteries began firing wildly into the sky.
That night, orders came from headquarters to fire back any way we could, even if it meant closing our eyes and firing into the sky. You see, it was so dark, and the aircraft were coming so quickly, and we didn't have the capability to aim accurately. That's why they told us, put up a barrage of fire any way you can.
In the approaching stealth bombers, the pilots saw the firestorm of shells and missiles exploding above the city. They flew straight towards it.
As I'm flying in, the aircraft was actually being buffeted by the AAA exploding. Looking back, it's kind of like an old World War II movie where they sit in the cockpit of their B-29s and bounce around over Dresden.
Dolson's bomb destroyed Iraq's main telephone exchange.
I just remember looking over my shoulder, and I thought to myself, you know, it's a miracle. There's no way anybody else is coming out of there.
A minute behind, Dolson's wingman was still flying through the barrage.
Stuff going off all around you, under you, you know, some of it arcing over above you. I know that I've trained my whole Air Force career to make sure that I could do this, and now did I have the right stuff now?
Leatherman destroyed the main telephone tower. Another laser-guided bomb hit the headquarters controlling Baghdad's air defenses. Other pilots destroyed government ministries and a key communications tower. Also targeted, Saddam's lakeside palace.
What we wanted to do was sever his ability to communicate with his frontline forces. And if that meant killing him,
then so be it.
Holy cow. That was a large airburst that we saw. It was filling the sky with dust.
And I think, John, that airburst took out the telecommunications. Yeah. Now you may hear a lot of sound.
CNN gave a running account to the rest of the world. 6 minutes after the stealth bombers left, the cruise missiles arrived. Some destroyed government buildings. Others dropped carbon filament, which shorted out the electrical grid system. The president and his advisors watched the war unfold on television.
This is one of those times when I really had a sense of history. I had the battle plan on my lap, and we were sitting here watching CNN, and to see the battle unfolding from the CNN parts, when the CNN announcer, a couple of minutes after the first radar should have been hit on the border, that we have reports of airstrikes down in the southern part of the country. So it was uncanny.
With Baghdad's air defense headquarters destroyed and its radar system in chaos, hundreds of Iraq's fighters couldn't operate. Only a few struggled into the air.
I see that somebody's targeted on me. It's an Iraqi fighter who wants to target me and shoot me down. And so I remember firing a missile. I remember seeing this big blue flame coming across the sky, 3 to 5 seconds long. And I remember seeing it, and then it goes away. I remember thinking to myself that my missile hit him and that the target's destroyed and that he's down, but what's ahead?
With hundreds of Allied aircraft flying, AWACS planes packed with computer equipment helped control the battle. That night, the coalition armada systematically attacked Iraq's war machine. The factories that made chemical and biological weapons, the Scud missile plants. In all, over 200 different targets were hit.
The first 24 hours consisted of more attacks in the master attack plan than the entire number of targets that were targeted in the years 1942 and 1943 during the combined bomber offensive in Europe.
That first night was a new benchmark in the history of warfare. The first time the world had seen precision bombing on a vast scale. And defying all expectations, only one Allied pilot, an American, had been killed.
And the whole world starts to watch this war in real time. And suddenly, one of the first scenes coming off one of our airfields is of this F-16 landing. Rolls to a stop. Canopy pops open, pilot comes out. I met him later. His name is Jet Jernigan, of all. I mean, right out of Hollywood Central Casting. Jet Jernigan is the young man's name. And I'm watching this in real time in my office, and suddenly the youngster turns around to talk to the reporters. And I said, uh-oh. No telling what Jet Jernigan is liable to say to a pushy reporter. And what Jet Jernigan says is, I'll tell you what it was all about. He says, first, I want to thank God that I completed my mission successfully and I got back to my base safely.
Been a very fortunate fellow.
Sounds pretty good. American people hearing this. Confident, young American pilot. Starts to walk away and he looks over his shoulder a second time. He says,
Lord bless me with a good woman.
Oh. He starts to walk away again. He looks over his shoulder a third time. He says, I want to thank God that I'm an American. And then he looks over his shoulder a fourth time. He says, I want to thank God that I'm an American fighter pilot. I about swooned.
God bless America.
American people saw this spirit of confidence, spirit of professionalism. It was a feel-good that we had not seen since the end of World War II.
With air superiority established over the Iraqis, the coalition airplaners were now confident enough to launch conventional aircraft on massive daylight raids.
My squadron was part of a large armada of airplanes doing one of the first daylight raids over Baghdad. My particular target was an oil refinery on the bend in the river in Baghdad. A lot of people trying to shoot at us. Another couple of missiles are fired. We maneuver heavily to avoid those missiles, and they go by us very, very nicely. You know, one went by on my right. I could see two go by my wingman on his left and right.
As I continued to roll my jet, I looked back over the right to where the missile would have gone, and there was a cloud of, just black and silver metal flying everywhere. And I thought, maybe I took a small hit. Well, in the nanosecond that it took me to roll up and look and make that assessment, my airplane just decided it's going to shut down, and all the systems just went boom. It's like somebody pulled the plug. And I thought, oh, Jesus, I'm hit. Engine quit, realized I was going to have to get out, and I just configured the aircraft as much as I possibly could to glide as far as I could. I wanted to get as far south as I could and as far away from the western edge of Iraq. And again, checked my map one more time and said, okay, I'm in the middle of nowhere, the sun's going down, this is not going to be too bad. Then all of a sudden, I see some clouds of smoke coming up, and I go, oh no, someone's shooting at me.
In Baghdad, Saddam Hussein was moving between safe houses in the suburbs. The bombing had been more devastating than he'd expected, without the civilian deaths he'd believed would outrage world opinion. His intelligence chief says Saddam's temper flared when he was briefed on the gravity of Iraq's situation.
I said, I know that Iraq will be destroyed. I am telling you the truth. Saddam said, these Americans are technicians, not soldiers who fight. They have technology on their side, but that won't help them win.
When Saddam met with his ministers after the first night's bombing, he had already ordered action he believed would shatter the coalition of Western and Arab countries attacking Iraq. Scud missile launchers hidden in the desert fired at Israel.
We had the capability, we did it. When you are attacked by an enemy, you attack your enemies. That's natural.
The Scuds were fired indiscriminately at Israel's largest city. Saddam calculated the Israelis would retaliate and join the conflict. The Arabs in the coalition would then refuse to fight alongside Israel. The coalition would collapse, and so would the war. Soon, more Scuds were on the way.
Well, I wasn't told. I heard them. And I rushed out of my home to go to our headquarters in the Defense Ministry, and on the way I heard the Scuds landing in the Tel Aviv area.
Israel's nuclear forces now went on full alert. 60 Israeli jets took to the skies. Early warning radar appeared to show Iraqi bombers headed for Israel. In the Pentagon, the defense secretary picked up the hotline to Tel Aviv. Israeli retaliation seemed inevitable.
Imagine an American president sitting quietly as missiles land on the United States saying, no, we're not going to do anything. I mean, that's an unacceptable political position for any government.
I think it was Cheney that called me, and I reported to him on the hits that we'd taken. I had no doubt that Israel was going to take action. The question was, action when, and what type of action?
The Israeli army reported nerve gas in the debris of one of the missiles. Israelis prepared for the worst.
We knew we had a real problem at this point, because if Israel got into the war, this was a real break for Saddam. If he provoked the Israelis into attacking him, then the chances of holding the coalition together really became problematical.
I must say that this is the darnest way to conduct an interview with...
Ultimately, none of the 8 Scuds that landed proved to have chemical warheads. After some discussion, Baghdad had decided the Israelis might retaliate against a chemical attack with nuclear weapons.
Now, we would like to see that threat removed, and we will take the actions that are necessary to remove it. I cannot tell you when, I cannot tell you where, I cannot tell you how.
Some of the Scud missiles were loaded with chemical warheads, but they were not used. They were kept hidden throughout the war. We didn't use them because the other side had a deterrent force.
The man who would decide what happened next was Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. He and George Bush disliked each other, and when Bush telephoned him, Shamir angrily told the president that if America couldn't stop the Scuds, the Israeli Air Force would.
Bush said to Shamir, pleaded with Shamir, tried to cajole Shamir that Israel not take any military action, that this would be injurious to the cause to the Allied cause, that in the final analysis this would also be injurious to Israel's cause.
This was not a warm and close and fuzzy relationship. But yet, for this one period, they communicated. And maybe because they hadn't been all folksy and friendly, it was almost more real because of it. And it was very, very straight, very honest, no flourishes, no frills. But I really think they got through to each other.
I think in such situations, you have not to play with words. It couldn't be a moment of diplomatic discussions and debates. And well, I explained to him, it's very difficult, Mr. President, it's very difficult. I don't know what the day of tomorrow will bring, but at this moment, we will act accordingly, accordingly with your concepts.
Israel became the president's top priority.
We were going to be redoubling our efforts in the darndest search and destroy effort that's ever been undertaken in out in that area, and I hope that is very reassuring to the citizens of Israel.
Washington's approach to the Scuds was purely a political approach. My approach was purely a military approach.
As I told you before, I think Scuds are militarily insignificant.
In Riyadh, Schwarzkopf rebelled against the new emphasis on Scuds. He wanted to use his Air Force to win the war, not placate the Israelis.
As you know, the total Scud launches have been...
No one in Israel was ever killed by a Scud missile. They did have some people die as a result of putting their gas masks on wrong, but no one was ever killed as a result of Scud missiles.
From my perspective, from the strategic perspective, and the president's perspective, and obviously I was doing this with the president's approval, it was vital to keep the Israelis out of the conflict. And that the way you did that was to make certain that they knew we were doing everything humanly possible to deal with that Scud threat.
Well, General Schwarzkopf thought that many of these people who had these easy answers about how to solve the Scud problem were a bunch of pointy-headed politicians who had never fought their way out of a wet paper bag.
Cheney overruled Schwarzkopf. Aircraft started to crisscross 28,000 square miles of desert, looking for perhaps 14 mobile Scud launchers. The pilots couldn't find the launchers or the Iraqi convoys bringing in more missiles.
I'm going to have General Glosson come back up here and show you some film that I think will speak for itself. Through the help
2 weeks into the Scud campaign, Schwarzkopf was finally able to show some results.
Let you look into the night sky of Iraq as we are attacking mobile Scuds. And now the pilot is maneuvering to drop laser-guided bombs on this target. There are a total of 11 vehicles in this area, and all of these are already loaded with Scud missiles, as you can see. These have already been fired.
In Washington, at Langley, in Virginia, CIA headquarters, this was being watched on CNN, as it was everywhere else. And the CIA analysts looked at it and they said, oh my God, those are oil trucks. And elsewhere, there was even a suspicion that they may have been milk trucks. As far as the American public was concerned, they remained Scud launchers. They were never told otherwise.
But there was another way to hunt Scuds. British Special Forces, the SAS, were operating deep inside Iraq. Schwarzkopf distrusted Special Forces, but the SAS commander had persuaded him to make an exception.
There had to be people on the ground. The human eye cannot be replaced by technology. We were well armed, we had good strength, we above all had the desert as our friend to retreat and hide into. We were told in very categoric terms Our priorities 1 to 10 were Scud, Scud, and nothing but Scud.
When they saw a Scud convoy, they attacked it.
On the 4th of February, we had a column that encountered a Scud convoy. They knocked out one missile. The engagement then lasted, I think, something about 4.5 hours. A young officer eventually called in the F-15s to take on the other targets.
Be aware that there are my friendly forces, 8 vehicles total in the open, 500 meters north and west. Your original target was 3 launchers plus associated vehicles by the burning light. Bombs away, bombs away.
But it was a huge desert, and the Iraqis simply moved their mobile launchers far away from the SAS's Scud box.
Now we're going home.
America had rushed Patriot missiles to Israel and Saudi Arabia to shoot down Scuds. In the skies above Tel Aviv and Riyadh, they dueled with the incoming missiles. The Patriots got as close as they could and detonated, filling the air with shrapnel. The Patriot became a symbol of resistance, damping down the pressure for Israel to join the war.
Patriot is 41 for 42. 42 Scuds engaged, 41 intercepted. I view it as an honor to be here, to come to Raytheon, the home of the men and women who built the Scud Busters. We're very, very proud of you.
The Israeli government thought all this was nonsense. The Pentagon was claiming a kill every time a Patriot exploded near a Scud, and the Israelis simply didn't believe the American figures. On the ground in Tel Aviv, experts from the Israeli military analyzed the damage every time a Scud fell to earth. What they discovered was kept top secret so as not to inflame Israeli public opinion.
When I met President Bush in Washington, we had some human argument because he was convinced that Patriots were doing a great job. I told him that at the very best, the intercept ratio maybe was 20% intercept probability. He asked me what I meant by that, and I said that maybe out of every 10 Scuds Patriots tried to intercept, they might succeed with 2. But in retrospect, I was overstating the case. I think that probably not a single Scud was intercepted by Patriot.
When the Scuds started falling, the Americans didn't realize that they were in fact breaking up as they were re-entering the atmosphere. The Patriot would see not only the warhead falling, but pieces of fuel tank, pieces of missile that were disintegrating. And the Patriot was designed in such a way that its radar would lock on an incoming object and fire 2 missiles at that object. Well, that's fine if you see 1 warhead coming in. It's not so fine if you see 6 or 7 pieces of junk coming in.
It was only after the war that Israel and the Pentagon acknowledged the limitations of the Patriots. As the air war continued, the British RAF Tornadoes were taking a beating during bombing raids over Iraqi airfields. The Tornado pilots were trained to fight a war in Europe, to surprise enemy defenses by flying low. But in the desert, these tactics left them vulnerable. In the first week, 4 Tornadoes were lost, 1/4 of the coalition casualties.
Out there it was burning blue. I mean, it was probably 8 o'clock in the morning, at 8:30, and it was blue sky and the visibility was 1,000 miles.
We were flying at maybe 60 or 70 feet and about 500 or 600 miles an hour, and there's this huge explosion and a flash, and the aircraft was hit by a missile.
Well, I had blue above my head. Suddenly the desert was above my head and it was just tumbling. I was going, eject, eject, and John said, don't bloody well eject, don't bloody... And I was going, eject. And eventually I just grabbed, we have the swing wing, obviously, in the Tornado, and I threw the lever forward, and the aircraft righted itself.
I couldn't see the back of the aircraft. All it was a ball of fire, and the fire was spreading its way down the spine of the aircraft towards me.
And then you say, this aircraft is going no further.
And then you go, give me the ejection drills, you know. It's actually half a second between pulling the handle and being thrown clear of the aircraft, and that half a second's like a lifetime.
And then it's as if someone, a huge giant, just grabs you by the shoulder, yanks you up, and I remember my head going forward.
And then there's the crack as the canopy opens, and you're left in your parachute. And it's deathly silent.
And then you realise how big the desert is. Then we saw some Iraqis coming towards us.
You could sense the anxiety and unease throughout the body politic. Gosh, it's been going on for a week. Why isn't it over? Maybe it's not going well. What are we trying to do? And we had not been sort of on stage to explain what we were trying to do. So I went up to see Secretary Cheney and said to the Secretary, you know, we've got to do something because this is, you know, we're starting to lose the public on this one.
The Secretary will have a short statement.
Many of the military commanders involved in Desert Storm believed that the press had been a prime contributor to the loss in Vietnam, that the press, by negative reporting, tended to undermine support for the U.S. military at home. Our strategy to go after this army is very, very simple. First, we're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it. Powell had a more sophisticated view. He recognized that the media was, for one thing, a very important part of his arsenal, because you can win the battle and lose the war through television. As a measure of effectiveness of how we're doing in the air campaign, I just pull these two things out. I've laundered them so you can't really tell what I'm talking about, because I don't want the Iraqis to know what I'm talking about. But trust me, trust me.
It was a telling moment, an American general saying, "Trust me," and getting away with it, a measure of how far the Army had traveled since Vietnam.
I think it showed that we had reached a point where American military had gained a level of credibility again with the American people and the press. And although there may have been members of the press who were skeptical about trusting me, the American people at that point were willing to trust me.
A week into the war, the air planners still believed that by bombing Iraq, they could deliver a decisive victory. The air campaign was still focused on Iraq's infrastructure rather than on the troops occupying Kuwait. But Saddam was determined to sit out the bombing. Officially, Saddam was not a target. But the Allies launched 260 missions against sites where they thought he might be hiding. Eventually, spies reported Saddam slept in private houses, changing location every night.
You can find out perhaps where he has been. You can find out even where he is. But what you need to know is where he's going to be, because you must mount an attack. And so it's almost an impossible task.
You might find it strange, but the President of the Republic of Iraq was sometimes driven around the city in an old taxi. It's strange but true that Saddam also used a lorry to move around the city. These are some of the measures he resorted to.
The Air Force kept searching. These Iraqi television pictures showing Saddam in an American-made Winnebago launched more missions.
When we saw him sitting in a Winnebago, we went after the Winnebagos with a vengeance, and whenever we saw one or tried to find one, and whenever we saw one or two or three, we would attack them as quickly as we possibly could.
The closest we came, we had a report that there was a convoy one night, a very, very large convoy moving down a road. We then attacked that convoy, and it's my understanding that we hit the vehicle in front of his and the vehicle behind his and killed the bodyguards in it and didn't touch him.
A week into the air war, Iraqi troops opened a Kuwaiti pipeline that flooded the Gulf with oil. The oil endangered the desalination plants that provided Saudi Arabia with drinking water. But the plants continued to work, and a bombing raid cut the flow of oil. Saddam was already planning a bigger move.
His strategy, of course, was to bleed the Americans and cause an outrage in the United States and a reaction which would lead to a negotiated settlement of the war. Well, he had to have Americans to bleed, but there were no Americans bleeding. So he hurried up his time schedule by, if they won't attack us, we'll attack them.
Saddam ordered his forces to attack a Saudi border town called Khafji.
وقال صدام أسروا لي اقبضوا لي على
Saddam said, capture for me 4,000 or 5,000 American, English, and French troops, and we'll use them as human shields. We'll tie them to our tanks and overrun the Saudi oil wells. If we do this, the Allied jets won't attack.
That evening, U.S. Marines sent an unmanned spy plane on a routine flight over southern Kuwait.
What do we have here? Crow. Let's see what they are. Man, this is something. Whatever they're towing, it's got 4 wheels on it. I don't see any tubes coming out. AA, perhaps?
As the drone beamed back television pictures of the Iraqi advance, Marine helicopter pilots waited for orders to attack. But the orders didn't come.
We'd been on the landline back to our wing headquarters, letting them know what was going on. We started, 1,000,001 scenarios began running through our minds on, why in the world would they not be letting us launch on these vehicles?
Guess what? Closer, closer. And 2,253 hours. They've crossed the border. Crossed in Saudi Arabia. King Fahd's going to be pissed. Fahd baby's going to be pissed. He's going to be hot.
For an hour and a half, the Marines waited for the airstrikes to begin. But at Air Force headquarters, they were concentrating on their strategic campaign. At first, they simply didn't see the importance of the Iraqi advance.
Where's our air? This is ridiculous. A frickin' bomber couldn't ask for any better target than that.
Why was the Iraqi advance not stopped prior to Khafji? A very straightforward, simple question deserves a very straightforward, simple answer. It was not the Air Force's best day.
But the Iraqis, too, had miscalculated. Khafji had been evacuated. The only people there were 2 Marine reconnaissance patrols hidden in the town.
I got the team together and I said, we've been practicing for some of us 5 years to play in the big game, and now here we all of a sudden get a chance. I think we ought to stay. And they agreed.
You're the only people there, yourself and another team of your buddies somewhere else in the city. And you know that that's it, the point of no return.
Stand by. Arm this missile, I'll shoot it down range. Take that bad boy out.
Baghdad announced a great victory at Khafji, but by dawn the next day, American artillery was in position. Hidden on rooftops, the Marines inside the city radioed precise instructions on where to fire.
When I finally got artillery fire, it was the best feeling in the world. Everything we called in was what we call danger close, which simply means that it's so close that the round could actually hit us instead of the enemy.
Every moment, the Marines in the town expected to be discovered.
The Iraqis came very close to capturing us. They were inside of our building for at least a day. You could see their heads down there, and if you wanted to, you could spit on them.
2 days later, Saudi forces formed up to retake their town. The attack would cost them 19 dead. Perhaps 100 Iraqis died. Meanwhile, airstrikes destroyed 2 Iraqi divisions desperately trying to reach Khafji. North of the town, one survivor recalls thousands of dead and scenes of carnage.
We were afraid. We could see death all around us. We could see people we had just spoken to, people we knew, people we'd lived with, wounded and dying. There was nothing we could do for them. We couldn't reach them, we couldn't save them or pull them to safety.
Saddam's terrible defeat at Khafji showed that because of American air power, the Iraqis could not attack and maneuver in the open.
I told General Schwarzkopf, I said, you know, I hate to say this at this time, but these guys aren't worth the shit. They can't put together, coordinate an attack above the brigade level. And I hated to say that because, you know, you hate to say something as definitive as that, but I was at that time convinced that we could really destroy these guys in detail.
The American side, particularly Schwarzkopf, never read the battle properly. They thought this was just kind of a minor excursion on the part of the Iraqis, when in fact it was a major attempt to start the war. So Schwarzkopf still continued to build his plan on the assumption that the Iraqis were going to stand and fight hard rather than to retreat. Schwarzkopf should have modified his plan. Well, he never did that.
Saddam became tense and anxious, although he always tried to conceal it. He was restless. It wasn't so much that he cared about the casualties, but they exasperated him.
Dozens of coalition prisoners, many of them pilots, were being held in Baghdad.
The Iraqis, the guards, put a wire around this here, ran it under my chin, and wrapped it around this here, and obviously hooked it to some sort of electrical device. They were very interested in having me say something on their camera, and I was not interested in telling them anything or saying anything on camera. I had told them quite a bit more than I'd wanted to at this point in time.
What was your mission?
So they turned on the juice. And what that did was basically drives your jaw together with violent force. All your muscles contract. My nose went to my chest, and it felt like a little lightning bolt hit me right in the forehead. It was a flash. And again, it was momentary contact, you know, a second on, and, you know, everything contracts in your body. And I started spitting out pieces of teeth.
What was your mission?
I'm exhausted now. I'm drenched in sweat and urine and everything else. And he finally says, look, you know, we'll let you talk to your wife and children. You probably are interested in it, you know, now it's very attractive to me. And I said, okay, I'll make the tape.
What was your mission? I was to attack an oil refinery near Baghdad.
So I was thrown back in the hallway, and I said, oh, I can't believe I made the tape. And this distinct British voice, not more than 3 feet away from me, says, don't worry, mate, we all made the tape.
They just yanked me up and just karate chopped through, and kind of felt like the heel of the boot just into my knee. And I collapsed again, and they just pulled me up, smack, pulled me up, smack, pulled me up, smack, pulled me up, smack. And eventually, and somewhere in there, whilst they're doing that, they say, are you pilot or navigator? Are you pilot? And eventually, pilot. And it just came out. I couldn't stop it. And that's when you realise you've broken to the violence. You feel a desperate sense of failure, that you've let everyone down.
هل لديك رسالة? Do you have a message?
I thought everyone thought I was a traitor, and that everyone would see that I'd failed, and that was the last image my family was going to see of me.
Terry, young darling, I love you.
I'm now going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq on this particular day. Keep your eye on the crosshairs. Right there. Look at here. Right through the crosshairs.
In Riyadh, the military's carefully screened videos were giving the impression that this was a bloodless war.
And now, in his rearview mirror,
the image that we got from the war has reinforced that American attitude that you can fight a clean war from the air with very few friendly casualties, and the only one being hurt on the enemy side are the enemy soldiers and not the enemy civilians. Wrong. War is a dirty, confusing thing, whether it's from the air or from the ground.
Late in January, we came to the lower part of the list, and one of those targets that we hadn't been able to get to before, because it wasn't high priority, was a bunker in the Al-Fridus area of Baghdad.
The things that we were monitoring, of course, showed some of the leadership people going to this bunker at different times during the night and leaving, and some of the signals that we were picking up indicated that things were happening in that bunker. It was not just a place to go sleep. And so that's why it became a military target, and that's why we bombed it when we did.
2 stealth bombers were assigned to the mission. Days before, a spy inside the Iraqi government had reported Iraqi intelligence was using the bunker.
We just followed the firemen in down a ramp. The heat was terrible, the smell was awful, and it was clear to me as we got into the main room that the bodies themselves had been ignited by the tremendous heat and were just burning in their own fat. And the firemen were just stepping over bodies as we did.
The bunker was a public air raid shelter. 204 people, many women and children, were killed. The shelters were the only places in the city with running water and electricity, so each night, families gathered in them.
The bunker that was attacked last night was a military target. A command and control center that fed instructions directly to the Iraqi war machine, painted and camouflaged to avoid detection, and well documented as a military target.
I miss my wife and my children. It's not fair. Nobody says something to stop this massacre.
We wondered momentarily if, in fact, there was some sort of a propaganda ploy. These people were Kurds that Saddam Hussein had murdered and then put in there, things like that. But it was obvious that, in fact, it was being used as an air raid shelter.
The Pentagon says if it had known about the civilians, the shelter would never have been bombed. But the military has always insisted that a section of Iraq's intelligence service also used this building. Baghdad has always denied it. But Wafiq al-Samarrai, now in exile, says the Americans are right.
Part of the shelter was used by this intelligence service. There were different groups, but mostly there were people from the Technical Affairs Department. They would often go in and out of the bunker. And on one occasion, Saddam himself visited.
The Al-Fridus disaster brought home the bloody reality of even a high-tech war and created a major public relations problem for the Allies.
I called General Schwarzkopf, we talked about it. I said, Norm, clearly we did what we thought was right, but it turned out to be full of civilians. We've got to look at the target list a little more closely. And we got to take a look at what it is we're doing in Baghdad itself. We didn't shut down all targets in Baghdad, but I asked questions like, why are we bombing the Ba'ath Party headquarters for the 8th time? Do we think there is somebody still in the Ba'ath Party headquarters? Why are we bouncing rubble with $1 million missiles?
The word was passed. bombing Baghdad now would be the exception, not the rule. And that ended the illusion that air power alone would win this war.
I thought it was a mistake to lift the intensity off of the leadership in Baghdad, and I thought it would give them an opportunity to show more mischief and be more involved in what was going on in Kuwait City and down with the Land Army.
How much more hitting of strategic targets in Baghdad would have caused Saddam Hussein to move his forces out of the desert? Ultimately, if you want to gain Kuwait back, and if you want to do what the United Nations charged us to do, you've got to go on the ground and take it back.
In the Saudi desert, 500,000 American, British, French, and Arab troops moved to their final positions. The ground war would begin in 11 days. Tomorrow night, the Gulf War continues.
The ground plan is what scared them all to death.
And look left and right, and you see mines everywhere.
The war behind enemy lines.
I looked up and I saw 5 Iraqi guys with their rifles pointed at me. So then I knew I wasn't dead.
The bombs came roaring through that building, picked me up, set me right back down on the floor.
The war between the generals.
So I said, we have not accomplished our mission.
I was just damn glad to have the victory in our hands with a minimum loss of casualties.
And the war's ragged end.
That is the aggressor, Saddam Hussein, still in power. That is the President of the United States, no longer in power. I wonder who won.
Don't miss the compelling conclusion of the Gulf War, tomorrow night on Frontline.
To learn more about the Gulf War, visit Frontline on the World Wide Web at the PBS homepage at this address. You'll find an interactive online supplement there, an extensive oral history of the war,
agreed with the president saying,
and more first-hand accounts from airmen and soldiers.
They kept asking, well, where were you from? Where were you flying? What was your target?
Find out more about the weapons and technology used for the first time. And then please give us your feedback. It's all at the internet address on your screen. Off the net, you can tell us what you think about our programs. By fax at 617-254-0243, or by snail mail at this address.
Funding for Frontline is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you. Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content.
You can order The Gulf War on home video cassette by calling 1-800-255-9424. This 4-hour series is $39.95 plus shipping and handling.
This is PBS. For a printed transcript of this or any Frontline program, please write to this address. Journal Graphics Incorporated, 1535 Grant Street, Denver, Colorado, 80203. To order by credit card, call 303-831-9000.
Tonight, the Gulf War continues.
The ground plan is what scared them all to death.
And look left and right. You see mines everywhere.
The war behind enemy lines.
I looked up and I saw 5 Iraqi guys with their rifles pointed at me. So then I knew I wasn't dead.
The bombs came roaring through that building, picked me up, set me right back down on the floor.
The war between the generals.
So I said, we have not accomplished our mission.
I was just damn glad to have the victory in our hands with a minimum loss of casualties.
And the war's ragged end.
That is the aggressor, Saddam Hussein, still in power. That is the President of the United States, no longer in power. I wonder who won.
And now the conclusion of the Gulf War.
Funding for Frontline is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you. This is Frontline.
For 6 weeks in the winter of 1991, an American-led military machine conducted an air war of unprecedented technological fury against Saddam Hussein. Its target? The centers of military and political life in Baghdad.
The air campaign, which was designed to drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait and win the war without the necessity of ground attack, had not achieved its objective. The Iraqis were very, very badly hurt. It achieved lots of its military objectives. But if you make the assumption that you go to war for a political purpose, which was to change the situation, it had not done that.
In the Saudi Arabian desert, over 500,000 American, British, French, and Arab troops waited for the ground war to begin.
There was a feeling that what they were about to do was something stupendous, something on a vast scale, that it was almost Homeric in its magnitude, and a feeling that it was going to be decisive. That this was the last act, that it had all been building toward this, and that there would be no messy ending, that it would be resolved by force of arms with this one last titanic battle in the desert.
In the final weeks before the ground attack into Kuwait, the Allied commander was haunted by the fear of massive coalition casualties. More than ever, General Norman Schwarzkopf's volcanic temper dominated the headquarters in Riyadh.
Working with Norm Schwarzkopf was sort of like watching a thermometer. The blood would start around the shirt collar, and then it would work its way up to the jawline and then to the ears. And by the time it got to the ears, you ought to watch out.
I would say that working for General Schwarzkopf was a privilege and an honor, but there were many times when if someone had asked me if I would rather have been in that war room or in a dental chair having a root canal without anesthesia, I probably would have chosen the dental chair.
Schwarzkopf was more than a bully. I mean, he was a competent military officer. But for most of the officers that served under him, it was a frightening thing to have this man of such large size and power just exploding all over you. And he did intimidate many of his subordinates, and most of them considered them to be a tyrant and a bully.
I have always regretted the fact that I have a temper. I think it's more the fact that I care so very much about the lives of our troops. When human lives are on the line, you cannot be cavalier. You can't do enough. You cannot do enough. You must do everything you possibly can and leave no stone unturned, and you can't settle. You can never settle for second best or a second-class solution when you're dealing with enterprises of such magnitude that they involve the lives of literally thousands and thousands and thousands of people.
Despite the devastating air campaign, Saddam Hussein still believed he could force a bloody stalemate on the ground, just as he had done in his war against Iran. And he believed that America, still traumatized by Vietnam, had a critical weakness.
Saddam Hussein was counting on Americans' aversion to casualties in support of his strategy, that when the Americans attacked, they would take so many casualties, the American people would rise up and say, this is not worth the effort, and let's see if we can have a negotiated settlement, and he would end up with the fruits of his aggression. That was his strategy.
For 6 months, the Iraqis had prepared for the Allied assault. Their frontline troops surrounded Kuwait behind a barrier of minefields, trenches, and barbed wire. And in reserve, Saddam kept his elite Republican Guard and their Soviet tanks. Despite the bombing, Iraq still had about 400,000 soldiers positioned for battle.
When you're proposing to launch an attack of the magnitude that we were going to launch, with the unknowns out there, you want to do everything you can to level the playing field, to make sure that your forces have every advantage.
But as the ground war grew closer, bitter arguments broke out among Schwarzkopf's commanders about how best to prepare for the land war. The ground commanders wanted to shift the air war to the Iraqi forces in Kuwait. The Air Force wanted to keep targeting Iraqi leadership in Baghdad.
I really believe that General Glosson, Buster Glosson, really believed in his own mind that if he could just have a few more days, hit a few more targets, that there wouldn't be a need for a ground war. Now, hardly anybody else believed that, but I think in Buster's own mind, he believed it.
The Army had one view, and the Air Force, obviously, probably with the Navy, had another view. We believed, and I still do, that the attacking of targets in Baghdad had as much or more to do with the success or failure of that field army than attacking it directly in the overall scheme of what our coalition was trying to accomplish.
They had 41 days of almost uninterrupted bombing. 41 days to bring Saddam to his knees. And someone says to me, or to those ground forces commanders out there, whether they're Army, whether they are coalition forces, or whether they're Marines, that if we didn't have to go out and shape the battlefield and hit those targets that you insisted on us hitting, we could have won this war. I think they're on drugs or something. They must be smoking something.
This air campaign, in its totality, was Norman Schwarzkopf's air campaign. It wasn't Cal Waller's, nor Buster Glosson, nor Chuck Horner's. And the campaign was part of Schwarzkopf's overall war plan. We executed that the way he wanted it executed. If that happened to not be the way Cal Waller thought it should be executed, that's tough.
I distinctly remember telling Buster Glosson one day, Buster, if you divert another flight of aircraft without my approval, I'm going to choke your tongue out. And I think he got the message after that.
Initially, B-52s from the Vietnam era were assigned to attack the Iraqi forces in Kuwait. But most of their bombs fell in an empty desert. An error in the navigation system was corrected, but high winds still blew most of the bombs off course.
We thought that we would destroy tanks somewhere between 20 and 30 a day, and we weren't coming anywhere close. We were down in the area of 6 or 8. And so after about 10 days of that, I knew that we had to do something different.
Lawson decided to send 2 sophisticated F-111 jets on a new mission.
Ready? Now, laser on.
When they reached the Iraqi front lines, the crews saw that even the best camouflage tank showed up as a white rectangle on their heat-detecting cameras. The tanks had grown hot in the daytime sun.
20 seconds. There's definitely something there. 4-2 is east.
Unlike the B-52s, the F-111s carried laser-guided bombs.
4, 3, 2, 1, impact. Okay, sequence.
I called General Ross and I said, Buster, you wouldn't believe how successful we were tonight. It was really shit hot. We had 7 for 8 direct hits, piece of cake.
The Air Force called it tank plinking. And soon, hundreds of these missions were being flown. Under the constant bombardment, the Iraqi army began to disintegrate. The Allies didn't yet realize it, but some 200,000 soldiers deserted.
It had a devastating effect. Let me give you an example. We paid an inspection visit to one infantry division. There should have been 15,000 soldiers in that division, but we found only 34. There was nobody left. 34 men out of 15,000.
I was wondering why didn't we think about this weeks ago. I was elated because I said, now finally we are providing the ground commanders with something that they sorely need to reduce the number of tanks that they're going to be faced with, or reduce the number of artillery pieces that will be bringing fire upon them as they cross the desert or try to reach those areas. So everyone was happy.
But the bombing of Baghdad also continued. One stealth bomber mission targeted an anonymous intelligence headquarters that was also a prison.
Unlike the way they say in the movies, the way you hear it in the movies, the bombs don't whistle in, they crackle because they're slowing down and crackling through the sound barrier. I heard it crackling through, and it came roaring through that building, and the whole building just literally just shook apart.
Then you hear the second bomb coming in, and by that stage you're fully curled up in a ball, and that's when you hear, and it's deafening as it comes in, and somebody kind of shouted, "Incoming!"
Went right through me, and it picked me up, set me right back down on the floor, and the building literally began to come down around me.
And then the third, and they just got closer and closer, and you just thought, you're just sitting there, waiting.
In Washington, President Bush was growing impatient. Colin Powell and Dick Cheney returned from a final meeting with General Schwarzkopf with the news that the Allied attack could begin in 2 weeks. But Bush was anxious. Moscow's support was weakening, and Gorbachev was suggesting the attack be postponed to allow for negotiations.
So we will just continue down this road. We're the ones that are going to set the time for how this war is, the time for any action that is taken. We are not going to suit somebody else's timetable, whether he lives in Baghdad or any place else. And that's exactly the way it should be.
The president had reason to worry. On Gorbachev's orders, a high-ranking Soviet diplomat traveled to Baghdad. Yevgeny Primakov's mission was to urge Saddam Hussein to accept a face-saving deal.
He came in wearing a long overcoat. It was cold. There was an electric stove on. When we were left alone, I told him, I'm not a military expert, but if a land offensive begins, your troops in Kuwait will be wiped out. You have a great burden of responsibility. Then he said, for the first time quite directly, Okay, I'm going to withdraw my troops from Kuwait. I just want to be sure that as I retreat, they don't shoot me in the back.
48 hours before the ground attack was due, Iraq's Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz arrived in Moscow. Saddam's admission that he was willing to withdraw had led to some frantic Soviet diplomacy to save their old ally from defeat.
Gorbachev, to me, was making one last attempt to try and have it both ways. He wanted to stay with the United States in the course of this conflict, and yet he also was under, I think, great pressure from various elements of the Soviet bureaucracy to try and preserve this client relationship with the Iraqis and with Saddam Hussein, who, after all, had been a Soviet client for many, many years.
Aziz went straight to the Kremlin. The Soviet president was waiting. Aziz told Gorbachev Saddam wouldn't accept the UN resolutions that called for Iraq to recognize Kuwait's independence and pay it compensation, but he said Iraq would withdraw from Kuwait. Gorbachev thought this was good enough. He called the White House.
I told President Bush, George, you shouldn't just be thinking about how to begin your attack. You should be thinking about how to avoid it. While the generals plan, we should think about how to end the war.
We kept coming back to him and saying, no, you continually are suggesting approaches which do not require an unconditional withdrawal. And we were never, 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 never going to accept a negotiating down from the UN resolutions.
The president summoned his key advisors to discuss the Soviet offer. If Iraq withdrew, it would mean no bloody ground war. But Saddam would walk away unpunished, his war machine undefeated. At dawn, the president called Gorbachev to tell him the deal was unacceptable.
It was a very difficult phone call for the president and a very anguished one for Gorbachev.
I said we shouldn't waste any time. We must still try to find a political way out. He said, I am interested in that. I'm interested in that, understand me. I'm interested in finding a political solution, but nothing happens. Well, I told him, don't lose that will. Don't lose the opportunity. Don't rush things. We're acting together. Let's find a political solution.
The president just said, no, I'm sorry. You know, he's had all the chances. He's had months. He's had from August 2nd. We have given him every opportunity. And we've told him that this aggression would not stand. And now it's too late.
Bush's carefully crafted international coalition was fragmenting. The French president, Francois Mitterrand, called to demand more time for diplomacy.
We received word that Saddam had blown the oil wells, and I went rushing up to the Oval Office, and Bush used it right then in the telephone call with Mitterrand, sort of, Francois, we've just received this piece of information that shows that we cannot delay, that Saddam is going to produce a catastrophe in Kuwait. He's already set all the oil wells on fire, and God knows what he may do next. And that pretty well resolved that issue.
As hundreds of oil wells blazed across Kuwait, the president issued a final ultimatum.
The coalition will give Saddam Hussein until noon Saturday to do what he must do. Begin his immediate and unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait.
Saddam ignored the warning. To obey, he believed, would have humiliated him in the eyes of the Arab world.
I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf to use all forces available to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait.
More than anything else in those final hours, I was asking myself, what did I forget? What have I missed? What more can I do? Once you have thrown the dice in the air, you can't call them back. At that point, all you can do is wait until they land on the table to see what the numbers come up. And that is a very awkward time because you can just sit there on your hands and wait. There's nothing more you can do.
Schwarzkopf's plan called for the U.S. Marines to attack first, straight into Kuwait. He expected that would draw the elite Republican Guard into battle. 400 miles to the west, French and American airborne troops would begin encircling the battlefield. 24 hours later, Arab armies would support the attack into Kuwait. Only then would 7 Corps' heavy armor smash through the Iraqi defenses and race in a left hook across the desert to destroy the Republican Guard.
My nightmare scenario was that our forces would attack into Iraq and find themselves in such a great concentration that they became targeted by chemical weapons or some sort of a rudimentary nuclear device that would cause mass casualties. That's exactly what the Iraqis did in the Iran-Iraq War. They would take the attacking masses of the Iranians, let them run up against their barrier system, and when there were thousands of people massed against the barrier system, they would drop chemical weapons on them and kill thousands of people.
Schwarzkopf's plan meant that Walt Boomer, the Marine commander, would be the first to lead his men into action. Despite the air war, Boomer feared storming the minefields and barbed wire of southern Kuwait would be a murderous affair, fought under a barrage of Iraqi chemicals and nerve gas.
I was overwhelmingly concerned about casualties. We were outnumbered when we attacked into Kuwait. Sometimes people have lost sight of that. But in addition to being outnumbered, there was this overriding concern, overwhelming concern about chemical warfare. This just occupied most of my waking moments.
Beneath the smoke from the burning oil wells, Marine assault units pulled on the clumsy charcoal-lined suits that might save their lives in a chemical bombardment. There were predictions that the Marines could take as many as 10,000 casualties in a week of fighting.
Weather conditions were absolutely critical. And the weather predictions that we were getting at that time were very mixed. The Marines do not have a lot of heavy artillery and depend upon their aircraft to provide the close air support to replace the artillery. And Walt Boomer came to me and said he was very concerned about launching his attack when the weather was predicted to be so bad.
Schwarzkopf called Colin Powell in the Pentagon and asked that the ground war be delayed.
We have a president who is anxious to get this over with. And I went and talked to Norm on the phone and said, Norm, look, this is getting hard to explain. And I took him through why it was getting hard to explain, and he just had it. He exploded and said, you know, you do not understand my problem. You're talking in political terms. If you don't care about the lives of young people, well, I do. That did it. I exploded, and I started shouting back at him. You know, I care as much as you do, but there's a limit, and I have to work in both the political world and the military world. He said, Colin, I think I'm losing it. I feel my head's in a vice. I said, you're not losing it. If you have our total confidence, we got a problem. We'll work our way through this problem. And then about 30 minutes later, Norm called and said, oh, weather's fine. We can go.
On the Kuwaiti border, advanced teams of Marine engineers began to crawl through the minefields and barbed wire that protected the Iraqi front line. They used fiberglass rods to probe for mines, marking safe paths for the first troops to race through the next day.
You see mines everywhere. You can look left and right, and you see mines, half-buried mines, full-view mines. just as far as you can see. You look left and right, and there's desert, and there's just lines and lines and lines and groups of mines out there. We crawled, low crawled, which is on your belly, probing along with the fiberglass rods. 70 meters in front of you, Iraqis. Marine snipers are behind us trying to suppress Iraqis that are moving through the trench lines. You hear artillery, mortars, small arms.
Meanwhile, 17,000 Marines headed for the beaches of Kuwait City. But they weren't going to land. It was only a feint. Schwarzkopf had decided there would be too many U.S. casualties and had canceled the amphibious landing. But he still wanted the Iraqis to think it was coming. That night, 20 miles off the coast, the guns of the battleship Missouri shelled the beach to complete the deception. The Missouri had fought against the Japanese in the Pacific, and this was to be her last battle. The shells achieved their purpose. Iraqi troops moved toward the coast and away from the point the Marines would actually attack in the morning.
1st Marine Division will cross west of the Al Wafra in zone at approximately 0-1200 at H-hour.
In the desert, the Marine commanders rehearsed their plans for the last time. They expected a tough fight.
While I remain apprehensive about some of their capability, I'm also confident that we can work through that. I think we can work through their chemical capability.
Before dawn, the attack began.
I don't think anyone predicted that the Marines would get much farther than maybe 5 kilometers. At the very most, maybe 8. And that then, with the enormous, overwhelming forces that were arrayed in that area, that it would stop the Marines.
We're going through the breach.
But by dawn, the generals realized something remarkable was happening. The Marine columns were driving right through the enemy positions.
Iraqi fighting positions.
While Allied aircraft watched for a counterattack, thousands of Marines poured into Kuwait, almost unopposed.
We expected casualties somewhere in the 25 to 30% range. But there was essentially no firefights, essentially no battles. The Iraqis were there, but they chose and they elected not to fight. In many respects, they could retreat and they could surrender much faster than we could attack or advance. And that the war really became a war of collection of enemy prisoners of war.
After 6 weeks of relentless bombing, half the Iraqi conscripts on the front line had already deserted. Those who stayed were just waiting for their chance to surrender.
Saddam said our young soldiers were behaving like women. They were turning into women. They weren't fighting like real men.
All right. You're all right.
This was not fair to our proud army. Our army did not believe in this war. It was a dirty war, this war in Kuwait.
The Marines waited for a chemical attack. It never came.
We didn't think that it was wise to use them. That's all what I can say, that it was not wise to use such kind of weapons in such kind of a war with such an enemy.
If chemicals had killed large numbers of Marines, the Pentagon had plans to flood Baghdad under 6 feet of water.
Knocking off the dams on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers would have caused enormous destruction downstream. The loss of civilian life would have been terrible, and we really had not thoroughly analyzed. We knew how to hit the dams, but I don't know if we analyzed what the effect downstream would have been. But nevertheless, it would have been a good one to threaten the Iraqis with. And of course, there was always the implicit threat of nuclear weapons. I don't think we ever would have used them. But nevertheless, the Iraqis didn't know that. And we could have if provocation was serious enough.
Lay down your weapons, come up. We will not hurt you. We are here to help you.
In those first hours, 8,000 Iraqis were captured.
Be home soon. It's great.
The Iraqi collapse was so sudden, the Allied commanders didn't yet realize how their success could undermine the larger plan.
My own guess is that about 75% of them gave up and about 25% fought. As the day wore on, I began to become elated.
The Marines had advanced into Kuwait so quickly, the Republican Guard didn't come south to counterattack. And 7 Corps' left hook attack was not due until the following day. That would give the Republican Guard time to escape. Schwarzkopf had miscalculated. But had there been evidence weeks earlier of what might really happen when the Allies attacked the Iraqis? Had there been lessons to learn from the Battle of Khafji? After Saddam attacked the Saudi town in January and his forces were destroyed, some of Schwarzkopf's staff began to suspect the Iraqis simply couldn't stay in a fight with the Allies.
If he had read Khafji correctly and had come to the conclusion, as was obvious, that the Iraqis were not going to be able to fight effectively and would probably retreat, he could have done a number of things. He could have speeded up the army attack, or he could have held the Marine attack and let the army go first, which was one of the things that was recommended to him by one of his general officers. But he didn't. He never reassessed the situation after Khafji and continued to assume that the Iraqis were going to stand and fight.
As a young officer in Vietnam, Schwarzkopf had learned the dangers of underestimating the enemy. This time he had done just the opposite. He had overestimated the Iraqis, and now he had to act quickly.
I decided to move the main attack up to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It became obvious that if we were going to inflict that damage on the Republican Guard, we had to go ahead and inflict it as early as possible.
1, 2, 3.
A withering artillery and rocket barrage for the main attack, 7 Corps' left hook, began that afternoon. Seven Corps' commander, General Fred Franks, like many of the American generals, was a veteran of Vietnam. He'd lost a leg, destroyed by a North Vietnamese grenade during the invasion of Cambodia in 1970. He was a careful, methodical man.
Memories of Vietnam are very sharp, clear to me. I mean, never far from my mind, and especially during the Gulf War. We didn't say it to each other, but I think we all felt that we're going to do it right this time.
Troops doing okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, good. Glad to hear it.
In many ways, Franks personified the Army after Vietnam. Maimed, traumatized. He was also a man who was constitutionally inclined to wait as long as he could before making a decision. One of his closest aides said he was a man who couldn't make the decision to pee if his pants were on fire. He was the kind of man who, by personal inclination, was not going to get along well with Schwarzkopf.
As the artillery barrage lifted, 7 Corps surged across the desert. This was the army that had been stationed in Europe to fight World War III. Now, the end of the Cold War allowed it to be unleashed against Iraq. The generals had expected 2 days of fighting to breach the Iraqi frontline defenses, followed by 6 days of massive tank battles with the Republican Guard.
I thought that we would lose somewhere between, in the breaching units, that we would lose somewhere between 20 and 40%.
The American 1st Infantry Division had the job of storming the trenches to clear a path for the tanks. To avoid hand-to-hand fighting, they planned to bury the Iraqi defenders alive.
A thought occurred to me, we could actually use these plows to fill in the trenches. In fact, I tested it myself. I got down in the ditch myself and had 2 tanks plow towards me just to see what it did. I learned several things. One is I learned that it happens very quickly. So the defender has a choice to make, but he has to make it very quickly. He can either give up and hop out of the trench, he can try to run down the trench and get away, but he better do those quickly because these things move at an amazing speed down there.
Along the Iraqi border ran a sand barrier, a berm. Beyond it lay 5 miles of minefields and then the Iraqi trenches.
You got the first one. First berm in a minute. That's real good. The second one's a tougher one.
Armored bulldozers and tanks fitted with plows broke through the berm and moved onto the trenches. 18-year-old Joe Queen drove one of the lead bulldozers.
What we did is we just took the dirt that the Iraqi soldiers had dug out. You just pushed that dirt right back into the trench. You could just look at the man's eyes and see fear. You know, you see him scared. You know, you're looking at the whites of his eyes as you're going through in the trench with this bulldozer covering in the trench. And they were firing at the bulldozer. And when the first bullet that hit the blade, that made me know then, hey look, this is for real. There's no game. Those are real bullets, and a bullet will kill you.
After the war, press accounts reported thousands of Iraqis were buried. Most independent analysts estimate it was just hundreds. The Army says it was about 150.
You don't think about, hey, what about this guy? What about that guy? He had a chance to get out. He had every opportunity to get out. And he took the way to die for his country, just like any American would.
By the end of the ground war's first day, all of Schwarzkopf's forces were on the attack.
I went to bed that night very satisfied with the fact that the campaign plan was unfolding and that it looked like we were going to have a terrific success on, you know, and accomplish everything we wanted to accomplish.
In Washington that Sunday, President Bush had received little news. If there were heavy U.S. casualties, it could finish him politically and could even stop the war.
I got briefed just before I went into the church. The president was right ahead of me. I passed him a note that said, "Mr. President, things are going very well." We all went back to the White House. I got out a map from Time magazine to sort of show him exactly what was happening. And I was able to tell him there that things were going extraordinarily well. We had assumed that the toughest part of the ground war in terms of casualties would have been the early hours of that conflict. And in fact, what we were finding was that the air war had been enormously effective and decimated the Iraqi forces, and that they, in fact, were collapsing in front of us.
But in Riyadh, the Allied commander was having a bad morning.
Schwarzkopf got up after a couple hours of sleep on the morning of the 25th and went in to look at the map in the war room, and he saw that the Marines were plunging ahead, that the 18th Airborne Corps out in the far west was plunging ahead. And then he looked and saw that 7th Corps basically had not moved since the time when he went to sleep. He completely and utterly lost his temper.
Just across the Iraqi lines, 7 Corps had stopped for the night. General Franks had decided there was too much danger of entangling his large force, of friendly fire, of too many casualties, if he continued the advance in darkness.
There's an old German saying that says, go slow now and go fast later. And so the scheme of maneuver, based on my own assessment and my discussions with the tactical commanders, my informant, my higher headquarters, that it would be actually faster We would conduct the mission faster if we did not continue it during hours of darkness, but would continue it at first light.
I was repeatedly calling up my subordinate commander and telling him, you know, we must attack, we must make contact with the enemy. They're running away on us, and we must gain and maintain contact to keep them from running away, and passing down these orders and then sitting back and hours later seeing that nothing was happening, nothing was changing.
General Schwarzkopf said in no uncertain terms, get 7th Corps moving right now and get them doing what it is they have to do. And if General Franks can't do that, I'll get somebody who can.
Meanwhile, inside Kuwait on the second day, the Marines pushed on towards Kuwait City. But Saddam had ordered a surprise. Out of the burning oil fields, hundreds of tanks from Iraq's second line of defense, the regular army, suddenly attacked the Marines' right flank. The Marines regrouped. Cobra helicopter gunships were quickly sent into the fight. It was the largest tank battle in the Marines' history.
We got the word that there was an Iraqi counterattack. As we arrived out there, we saw horizon to horizon Iraqi tanks, armored vehicles. And as we started hitting these tanks and things started happening in our favor, the attack basically just ground to a halt. All the tanks stopped, the armored vehicles stopped, the hatches flew open. The Iraqis started bailing out of the tanks and, scrambling around in the desert trying to figure out what was going on.
The Iraqi troops tried to retreat back into the oil smoke.
It was like, something out of a, spaghetti western with the tripwire and the horses falling. It was, as you engage these troops with 20 millimeter, it was the first time I'd ever done that, and they just kind of pitch over in the desert.
Over 100 armored vehicles were destroyed.
Flying over the oil wells, it was like something out of Dante's Inferno. The thick black oil field smoke. A littered battlefield, burning tanks. Aircraft flying around. Very surrealistic, and you almost had to slap yourself in reality to go out there and do your mission.
In Baghdad, Saddam was told his counterattack had failed and the Allied advance on Kuwait City had resumed.
Saddam was very upset. He was deeply depressed, and for reasons known only to himself, he accused 5 top-ranking officers of betrayal and then ordered their execution. The sentence was carried out immediately by his personal guards.
Once we broke that counterattack, we broke their back. That was the last gasp on their part to throw us back out of Kuwait. And from then on, we had a pretty straight shot into the city.
But that night, one of the last Iraqi Scuds finally found its mark in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia.
There was a glitch, basically, a technical glitch that blinded the Patriot temporarily to this one particular Scud. The Scud, by luck, hit a warehouse that was being used as a barracks and immediately caused an inferno.
28 American soldiers were killed. 98 more were wounded, the worst Allied casualties so far.
Had this catastrophe occurred right at the beginning of the war, it could very well have changed perceptions of the war, the cost of the war. It would have certainly caused doubts about the Patriot, and might have caused the Israelis to leap into the war in ways that they didn't otherwise. So the fact that the tragedy in Dammam occurred when it did rendered it almost a footnote.
with that damn thing. Get the cameras out of here right now. Get out of here. Get them out.
That same night, the Iraqis began to pull out of Kuwait City. Iraqi soldiers piled into every vehicle they could find. A vast convoy headed north.
Saddam himself issued the order to withdraw. When the land assault started, he became desperate. He was now convinced that it was impossible for him to keep Kuwait.
I frequently talked to the resistance in Kuwait City via satellite telephone. I picked up, and it was a colonel from the Kuwaiti Air Force who'd been trapped in Kuwait City, and he'd been in the resistance all this time. He started to tell me about the Iraqis forming up and fleeing the town. He became so emotionally happy, relieved, overjoyed about his country being freed, the terrible oppressors leaving. He started to cry. I'm embarrassed to say it, but I started to cry as well. I've never been so touched in my entire life.
An F-15 crew, their aircraft laden with bombs for an attack into Iraq, was given a new mission. They were ordered to hit the convoy leaving Kuwait City and to stop it at all costs. As the crew walked to their aircraft, their commanding officer stopped them. He just received the first report of the casualties caused by the Scud that had landed on Dhahran.
I told him of the importance of the mission. It's not just a retreating army. And these guys are rapists, killers, murderers. And coincidentally, a Scud had just hit Dhahran Airport and killed 60 Americans. And convinced them, and I'm sure that I did, that they needed to put some hate in their heart and go out and stop those son of a bitches from getting out of Kuwait.
As we dove out of the clouds, the picture was absolutely astounding. There were thousands of headlights heading on every road that led north out of Kuwait City.
It's almost like hitting the jackpot. I mean, there are vehicles all over the place. It is a very lucrative target.
We had 12 500-pound bombs, and we elected to drop them 3 at a time.
The bombs impact in a string right across the highway, with the center bomb impacting on in between 2 trucks, as a matter of fact, causing both of the trucks to burst into flame.
Those first bombs destroyed the lead vehicles and created a huge traffic jam. Soon other aircraft arrived, their cluster bombs wreaking havoc on the stalled convoy below.
There were many wounded people on the road, some of them without arms or legs. They were just stranded there, half dead. When they saw our car, they started to crawl towards us. We didn't have space for them. With all the strength they could muster, they were throwing themselves at the side of the car. The windows were smeared with blood. But we had no space. We had to drive on.
The pilots called it the Highway of Death. Three days into the land war, the army that had occupied Kuwait City for 7 months no longer existed as a fighting force. Thousands of footprints led off into the desert. Hundreds had been killed. In the coming hours, what happened here would become an important factor in ending the war.
Why did we bomb them? Because there was a great deal of military equipment on that highway. I had given orders to all of my commanders that I wanted every piece of Iraqi equipment that we possibly could destroyed. This was not a bunch of innocent people just trying to make their way back across the border to Iraq. This was a bunch of rapists, murderers, and thugs who had raped and pillaged downtown Kuwait City, and now were trying to get out of the country before they were caught.
An American surveillance plane now recorded this radar image of the battlefield. It showed Saddam's best troops, the Republican Guard, were starting to escape.
General Schwarzkopf was possessed with the Republican Guards from the outset. I mean, it was as if this was Saddam's crown jewel. And any mention of the fact that the Republican Guards might slip away or might not be annihilated or destroyed was repugnant to Norman Schwarzkopf.
It was now the third day of the land war, and 7 Corps had still not engaged the Republican Guard. Schwarzkopf was furious.
Here we have the golden opportunity to accomplish far beyond our dreams what it is we set out to accomplish, and to get this thing over once and for all very quickly. And it doesn't seem like we are able to capitalize on that opportunity.
7 Corps tanks were driving hard. Schwarzkopf wanted them to drive harder. He had assumed the Republican Guard would move south to defend Kuwait, but they hadn't, and 7 Corps struggled to make up the distance. Schwarzkopf wanted a headlong charge. General Franks was more cautious.
You get the probability of an attack that starts and stops and starts and stops, loses momentum. I wanted to hit the Republican Guards with a 3-division fist. I didn't want to poke at them with fingers. In other words, piecemeal commitment of my forces. I want to hit them with a fist at full speed, at full speed.
And I kept saying, but the enemy situation has changed, and therefore the plan should be changing, and that's the whole reason why we moved up the main attack. We've got the enemy reeling, and most importantly, they hadn't encountered any fire.
With that, General Schwarzkopf indicated, Freddie, let's get this mission accomplished, and let's do it ASAP.
On that third afternoon of the war, the battle was finally joined with the Republican Guard. A cavalry troop of 9 tanks and 12 armored personnel carriers was leading the 7 Corps advance. Ahead, behind a slight rise in the desert, Republican Guard tanks waited in ambush.
As we crested the rise, my gunner identified tanks to our direct front, and he said, "Identified tanks." I yelled, "Fire." As I was yelling fire on the intercom, the gun erupted. The round impacted on the frontal slope of the tank, and the tank commander was ejected out of the hatch, and he himself was in flames. As the other tanks crested the rise, they began to select their targets and engage in an almost simultaneous manner. So 15 seconds before, there was a cohesive or coherent Iraqi defense. 15 seconds later, that defense was completely in flames. When we look back over the armored vehicles, you think, my God, this is what an armored cavalry troop in the assault can accomplish in that short amount of time.
28 Republican Guard tanks were destroyed. There were no American losses.
When 7th Corps finally, engaged the enemy, they did a marvelous job. And I was quite relieved that they had finally gotten up there and gotten in contact with some of the Republican Guard and could start, get on with the battle.
That night, 7 Corps routed an entire division of the Republican Guard. The other 5 Republican Guard divisions started a desperate retreat. But in Washington, there was already talk of ending the war.
Colin Powell and Dick Cheney came over to the White House to give the president their daily report on how the war was going. And by that time, we knew both from the military reports and from satellites about the highway of death leading north out of Kuwait City and the incredible destruction of the Iraqi convoys and so on. We knew all this would eventually be on television. And I remember very clearly Colin Powell saying that this thing was turning into a massacre, and that to continue it beyond a certain point would be un-American. And he even used the word unchivalrous. And he said that he thought that they were probably within 24 hours of concluding the war, of completing their objectives.
72 hours after crossing into Kuwait, the U.S. Marines were on the outskirts of Kuwait City. Destroyed Iraqi tanks lined the road. The Marine commander had once feared thousands of his troops would be killed, but only 28 had died.
We had made arrangements for the Arab coalition forces to go into the city. And I was sitting there getting a little restless and wondering, okay, what are we going to do? I'm tired of sitting here, so we drove into the city. And the outpouring was something I'll never forget. I don't know where all the people came from. They came down to the side of the road by the thousands. And they had Kuwaiti flags, and some had American flags. Vehicles that the Iraqis hadn't stolen or destroyed, they had acquired some of those, so they were driving around us in this mad circle. I thought, sure, we were going to crush a vehicle. What they were saying was, God bless you, America, God bless you. You know, we love you. Very, very emotional moment for us after all of this.
In Baghdad that morning, Saddam Hussein was fighting just to survive. The Allies were trying to cut off and destroy his retreating army, especially the Republican Guard, one of the keys to his power in the region and inside Iraq. Even Saddam feared his regime might be finished.
He sat in front of me, and he was almost in tears. Not crying, but almost in tears. He said, "We do not know what God will bring upon us tomorrow." He was virtually collapsing. He had reached the depths.
The Marines had liberated Kuwait City, but the most intense fighting of the war had yet to begin. The heavy armor of 7 Corps was chasing the Republican Guard. They had destroyed one division the night before. The remaining divisions were now trying to escape toward Basra, leaving behind only a rear guard to protect their retreat. As 7 Corps advanced, the Iraqi rear guard prepared for battle. Scores of tanks from the Republican Guard's Medina division dug in along a low ridge. The defensive line stretched for 6 miles. What happened next became known as the Battle of Medina Ridge.
I know there's enemy out there, but I don't know where the heck they're at. And then, boom, we were in it. I look up, and it was about 3,700 meters away, and there's BMPs and T-72s sitting on the ridge. The whole brigade online, within 3 seconds, had let loose with their first rounds. Moving about 20, 25 miles an hour, like a cavalry charge towards the Iraqi emplacements. And all you could see every time we shot was a massive explosion.
The guns on the American tanks had a range of around 2 miles, twice that of the Soviet-made Iraqi tanks.
The turrets were flipping 40, 50 feet in the air. 11 tons of steel just, it was incredible to see a gun tube and the turret just spinning up in the air and landing hundreds of yards away from the vehicles. We took very few prisoners at Medina Ridge. Very few. I saw 3. And in the desert, you could see for miles. Most people I saw were dead.
Later on in the battle, when I rolled up there was pieces everywhere. I have never seen such destruction in my life. I was just shocked that people can do so much devastation in such a short period of time.
300 Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles and their crews were destroyed at Medina Ridge. Only one American was killed. Nothing now stood between the retreating Republican Guard and destruction. A radio message told Saddam Hussein of the defeat.
He thought that his downfall was imminent. He asked me straight out, "Do you think that the Allies will come as far as Baghdad?" He was quite desperate and frightened.
Having destroyed the rear guard, 7 Corps pushed on towards the sea. Meanwhile, the American 18th Corps advanced to cut off the remaining Iraqi resistance. "60 helicopters from the 101st Airborne Division leapfrogged 100 miles ahead, deep into the Iraqi desert. The troops had orders to build an airbase from which Apache helicopter gunships could attack the retreating Republican Guard until the American tanks closed in. Within 2 hours, the base was operational. Waves of Apaches arrived and refueled. Then they headed north to hunt for the enemy. Doug Gabram led one flight of 4 Apaches.
We took off due north as fast as we could go, probably 30 feet off the ground, 120 knots. The terrain changed. We started flying over marshes.
This is what Gabram could see through his gun camera. He found the retreating forces on a causeway built across the marshes.
We saw people, dismounted infantry. I'd see the AK-47 raised with the white flag on it. Initially, I didn't fire. My chalk 2 or 3 would say, "Hey, the guy's shooting at us. You know, they're shooting at us with white flags on the end of their barrels." And my philosophy changed, and that I'm not going to take any chances. So when I see troops, I'm going to fire.
I got people running the road there. I only count 3 airplanes. Where's the other one? See you left door. Stay ready. Roger that. He's taking fire out your left door right now. This is Aircraft 4430 at 16.
Hundreds of soldiers were lying in the reeds along the edges of the causeway.
And scratch 1, BMP.
As Gabram continued down the causeway, an F-16 pilot who'd been shot down and was parachuting to the ground put out an emergency broadcast. The pilot managed to land safely and a rescue mission set off. Dr. Rhonda Cornum was one of the crew.
This was an opportunity to really go save somebody, we thought, and we took 2 Apaches and my Black Hawk and just started going there. Right within a couple kilometers of where this guy supposedly was, and we're still seeing American troops, so we thought, man, it's going to be not difficult. And then all of a sudden, like maybe a minute later, we are in the middle of a crossfire, just the worst anti-aircraft guns we'd ever had. We'd gotten shot at before, but it was clear that these guys were waiting for us. You could feel the aircraft shudder. Then I think that's when the tail boom kind of separated from the rest of the aircraft. And then everything went black. It was some time later, and all of a sudden I just realized I was lying down, and I thought I was dead. It was the most weird feeling because nothing hurt and I couldn't hear anything, and it was very peaceful. And I thought, well, I must be dead. I looked up and I saw 5 Iraqi guys with their rifles pointed at me. So then I knew I wasn't dead, and I knew I was captured. Then one of them reached down, grabbed me by the arm, and stood me up. And that's when he separated my already broken right arm. And then I knew I was pretty badly hurt and clearly not dead. So they took off my flight helmet, and all this long below shoulder length brown hair came out. And until then, I'm sure they just thought I was a skinny guy. But all of a sudden they realized, oh my goodness, this is a girl. I was just leaning back on the seat, and all of a sudden, I feel this guy sitting next to me who puts his hand on my face and starts to kiss me. And I thought, well, how bizarre. And I don't know what I was thinking, but I really thought, surely he can do better. I mean, I've got one eye I got a cut above my eye and it's soaked with blood, and I'm sure I don't smell very good. And I'm thinking, how can he possibly want to do this? And then he unzipped my flight suit and started fondling me, and I thought, I can't believe it. A lot of people make a big deal about getting molested, and I'm sure it's a big deal. But in the hierarchy of things that were going wrong, that was pretty low on my list.
All afternoon, waves of gunships attacked the retreating Iraqi troops. In the confusion of battle, no one could be sure how many units were retreating undetected. But the American forces intended to cut them off and trap them all in a ring of Allied tanks. More than 70,000 Iraqis had surrendered.
It doesn't seem like this third war. I just feel sorry for them, and it doesn't seem like they want to fight.
If the Allies were going to close the ring on the Republican Guard, the fighting would have to continue. But in Washington, Colin Powell was worried that further slaughter would stain the military's reputation.
You don't do unnecessary killing if it can be avoided. At some point, you decide you've accomplished your objectives and you stop. We owned Kuwait City. The question was, how much additional destruction do we want to inflict upon the Iraqi army that was in the Kuwait theater?
On the battlefield, Apache gunships designed to destroy tank columns were hunting down individual soldiers. Colin Powell had once said of the Iraqi army, "First, we're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it." The Iraqis were not completely cut off, but Powell decided there had been enough killing. He called Norman Schwarzkopf. It was 7 a.m. in Washington, 3 p.m. in the desert.
Colin said to me, "What are your plans?" My response to him was, "We plan to continue to execute the operation and continue to drive towards the sea, east towards the sea." And he then said to me, "How long would that take you?" And my response to him was, it will take until the end of tomorrow. So we could cease fire tomorrow evening at dark, and we would have completely accomplished the plan.
Sitting in the Pentagon, Powell knew this meant another day of killing. The president had to make a decision.
After talking to Schwarzkopf, I went over to the White House. I took the president through the situation on the ground. I pointed out that we were starting to see some scenes that were unpleasant. And we were in the window of calling an end to it so as that there was not unnecessary additional loss of life on the part of American and coalition forces or on the part of Iraqi youngsters.
Colin said, we basically have done it. We have destroyed the Republican Guard. We have expelled them from Kuwait. We have essentially completed our objectives, and I believe we are just a few hours from completing that effort.
And I would expect that within the next 24 hours, I would be bringing you a recommendation with respect to the cessation of hostilities. The president then said, well, if that's the case, if we're within the window, why not end it now?
Colin Powell called me. He said, I'm at the White House. We've discussed ending the war. Could you execute a ceasefire if it was declared effective midnight Washington time tonight? I told him that I could live with that. Quite frankly, if we went on another day, we were going to kill some more of our people, and we had already won an overwhelming victory with a minimum of casualties, and that was good enough for me.
At 5:57 p.m., the president told Powell to stop the war. It's the thing to do, he said.
It was a decision that, as best I can recall, there was absolutely no dissent from on the part of any of the president's advisors.
Deep down, I wondered if we really had done quite enough, but I did not dissent from the decision. Did not argue that we should go another day.
In the war room, there'd been no thought of ceasefire, only of completing the plan and completely trapping the Iraqis the next day.
General Schwarzkopf walked into the war room, and he said, "We are going to have a ceasefire." Well, I thought that he was jesting, so I said, "That's bullshit." So he says, "No, I'm serious. We will have a ceasefire." So I said, "We have not accomplished our mission. Why is it that we're going to stop what we set out to do and stop the war?" And General Schwarzkopf says, "Cal, God damn it, the President of the United States has made a decision to stop this war."
Ladies and gentlemen, General Schwarzkopf.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here.
A few hours before the president made his decision, Schwarzkopf had summed up the state of the war before a worldwide television audience in a bravura performance that became known as the mother of all briefings.
Why we were doing it. But we have rendered completely ineffective over 29 Iraqi divisions, and the gates are closed. There is no way out of here. There is no way out of here, and the enemy is fighting us in this location right here.
Schwarzkopf's orders were to destroy the Republican Guard, not neutralize them, destroy them. And when he got up in his briefing, the mother of all briefings, he said the gate is closed, meaning that our forces had cut them off and that they were helpless, lying helpless in front of us.
Yeah.
You said the gate was closed. Have you got ground forces blocking the roads to Basra?
No.
Now, is there any way that they can get out that way?
No. That's why the gate's closed. Right here, yeah.
Of course, that wasn't true at all. The gate was not closed, and it was still wide open at Basra, and the Iraqis were fleeing. And they had brought their corps headquarters across the Euphrates, and then they were bringing the rest of the divisions across, and ended up with about two-thirds of the Republican Guard units escaping with about 50% of their equipment. So he never carried out the goal that he had set for himself in his own mission orders.
Why did you draw back at this moment?
Well, I don't consider it a drawing back. From the information that I had in my headquarters, we had inflicted tremendous damage on the Republican Guard. We had bombed them for over 30 days straight. We had attacked them and fought them. We had destroyed many, many, many pieces of equipment. We had attacked them from the air during the ground campaign and inflicted great damage on them. So I already felt that there were several divisions of the Republican Guard, it was reported to me, that had been destroyed. It wasn't 100% destruction, but had we been allowed to go on for one more day, it would not have been 100% destruction then.
Just hours before the ceasefire went into effect, the British Army charged out of the desert towards the road running from Kuwait City north to Iraq.
As we pulled over the top of the ridge, in front of us was the highway. We'd seen dead bodies before, but it was in the next few hours that once you were actually in and among it for the first time, walking around, clearing your positions or whatever, that's when it started, you know, they actually came across of how much carnage there was there.
None of the pictures of the Highway of Death had yet appeared on television, but these were the scenes the men in the White House had anticipated as they weighed the political risks of continuing the war. Hundreds had died here of an estimated 25,000 Iraqis killed in the war. As many as 12,000 soldiers had died during the 6 weeks of the air war, along with 2,300 non-combatant civilians. And another 10,000 Iraqi soldiers were killed during the 4 days of the ground war.
There was a lot of civilian equipment that had been stolen. from Kuwait City, for me, the thing that I found most distressing was the smell of cheap perfume, this sweet, sickly smell. I was ready for the smell of war, but I wasn't ready for the smell of kind of everyday life and normality. I felt there was an immense sense of evil there. I mean, I detested being there. And for 3 days that we actually sat on the highway, I hated it. And it enveloped me more and more and more.
Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. I am pleased to announce that at midnight tonight, Eastern Standard Time, exactly 100 hours since ground operations commenced and 6 weeks since the start of Operation Desert Storm, all United States and coalition forces will suspend offensive combat operations.
3 hours later, the fighting stopped.
And as the word filtered down that the war, in fact, had ended, 2nd Brigade rooted around for a copy of Lee Greenwood's tape that had become the anthem of the Desert Storm operation, and they couldn't find Lee Greenwood. All they could find was James Brown, I Feel Good, which was an anthem from a different war of a different kind. 1968, I think it came out. So they plugged James Brown into this truck with big speakers on it. And you heard James Brown, I Feel Good, blaring all over the desert as their hymn of thanksgiving that the war was finally over.
I phoned Saddam and told him that Bush had agreed to this ceasefire. He felt himself to be a great, great hero. He started to say, we won. We won. His morale rose from 0 to 100.
Each day of war had left Saddam's regime more vulnerable to overthrow. Now the humiliation was over. The greatest fear of Allied tanks in Baghdad was gone. The Allies had stopped the war. Saddam could concentrate on surviving.
On the question of going to Baghdad, if you remember the Vietnam War, we had no international legitimacy for what we did. As a result, we, first of all, lost the battle in world public opinion. Eventually, we lost the battle at home. In the Gulf War, we had great international legitimacy in the form of 8 United Nations resolutions, every one of which said, kick Iraq out of Kuwait. Did not say one word about going into Iraq, taking Baghdad, conquering the whole country, and hanging Saddam Hussein. That's point number 1. Point number 2, had we gone on to Baghdad, I don't believe the French would have gone, and I'm quite sure that the Arab coalition would not have gone. The coalition would have ruptured, and the only people that would have gone would have been the United Kingdom and the United States of America. And oh, by the way, I think we'd still be there. We'd be like a dinosaur in a tar pit. We could not have gotten out, and we'd still be the occupying power, and we'd be paying 100% of all the costs to administer all of Iraq.
Two days after the ceasefire, a brigade of Republican Guards returning to Iraq fired upon the 24th Infantry Division. The Americans replied with overwhelming firepower. 7 months after Iraqi forces marched into Kuwait, the last battle had been fought. The conflict cost 240 coalition lives, 146 of them Americans. After the war, over 10,000 veterans would claim they were victims of a Gulf War syndrome, illnesses caused by their service. The Pentagon says there is no evidence of a syndrome, but medical studies continue. Iraq had been broken as a military threat, but Saddam had escaped with a third of his forces from Kuwait and his hold on power.
You know, to be very honest with you, I haven't yet felt this wonderfully euphoric feeling that many of the American people feel. You mentioned World War II. There was a definitive end to that conflict. And now we have Saddam Hussein still there.
He's sitting there with a frown on his face and saying to himself, why don't I feel better about this? In other words, he's signaling that, yeah, it was all great, it went right, but there's still something wrong, there's still something missing. I don't feel the same elation I felt when we had won World War II. And the reason, I think, is obvious, that it was an incomplete victory. It was a modest victory, snatched from the jaws of triumph, and Saddam Hussein was still in power.
Now another war began, the war to overthrow Saddam Hussein. In Iraqi cities in the south, close to the Allied front lines, Saddam's rule had collapsed. Ordinary people, mostly Shia Muslims, took up arms against a regime they hated. During the war, President Bush had called again and again for the Iraqis to overthrow Saddam.
And there's another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands and force Saddam Hussein to step aside. We have no argument with the people of Iraq. Our differences are with that brutal dictator in Baghdad.
As the rebellions erupted, Bush repeated his call for Saddam's overthrow. In Basra, soldiers who had fled from Kuwait joined the rebels.
It wasn't organized opposition. People just rebelled against oppression, rebelled against cruelty and starvation, against the executions and detentions. There was injustice, and people in the streets rose up to overthrow this regime.
In the first heady days of the uprising, the rebels, not Iraqi officials, controlled the streets.
We did not think, the president nor any of us thought at that time that Saddam would continue in power, having suffered such a resounding defeat.
With victory won, the political concentration that had brought such success now seemed to desert the White House team. Washington left the details of the ceasefire for the generals to work out alone.
Norm Schwarzkopf said, how did we make this happen? What do we do? And we had a State Department representative in our war room, and he said to the State Department representative, what is it we're supposed to do, Mr. State Department rep? And the State Department rep gave what we call the Iraqi salute. He didn't know.
I had no instructions whatsoever, so lacking any, and based upon the conversations Cole and I had had, I called my stenographer in and dictated my own terms of reference, and then I called up Colin and said, I'm going to send these to you. You know, if you all approve, then send them back to me, and this is what I'll do.
The Pentagon changed happy to glad, we to they, and put in a few fixes, gave it to the State Department. The State Department changed a couple of words and sent it back to us and says, use this.
Schwarzkopf decided that the ceasefire talks would be held in coalition-occupied Iraq, near the town of Safwan. The Iraqi leadership wanted a deal that would return their captured territory and give them the freedom to crush the rebellions. Schwarzkopf's objectives were simpler.
I went to Safwan with my own instructions, which basically, number one, was to get our POWs back, and then number two, to make sure that we had very, very clear lines drawn so that we didn't have any inadvertent battles after that.
A pair of Apache gunships hovered over the approaching Iraqi convoy. Just hours before, Saddam had personally briefed the Iraqi generals arriving to meet Schwarzkopf.
Saddam wanted to consolidate the ceasefire in any way he could, and he ordered his officers to give any information they knew about the minefields and the prisoners of war. He didn't want to give the West any excuse to resume fighting. He wanted to sign a ceasefire agreement at any price.
Accompanied by the Saudi commander-in-chief, Schwarzkopf led the defeated Iraqi generals to the tent where the meeting would be held. Once the talks got underway, Schwarzkopf got everything he wanted. But so did the Iraqis.
What they were most concerned about was that this was going to be a permanent border. And over and over again, they kept saying, is this a permanent border or is this just temporary? And I kept having to reassure them that, no, this is not a permanent border. This is a temporary demarcation line between our forces. And then this fellow looked at me and said, well, can we fly our helicopters? And I knew the great devastation we had inflicted upon their roads and their bridges, and that seemed like a very reasonable request to me.
And then the Iraqis asked the question, which should have given Schwarzkopf pause, and that was, well, how about armed helicopters? And Schwarzkopf, without even thinking, said yes, armed helicopters. Now, what the Iraqis had in mind were using their helicopter gunships to put down the Shia uprising which had taken place, and Schwarzkopf gave them carte blanche to do it. So he was finessed by the Iraqis at the Safwan conference.
The Iraqi generals got exactly what Saddam wanted, to the astonishment of some of the civilian architects of the war.
They should surrender their equipment, the lot. When you're dealing with a dictator, he has got not only to be defeated, well and truly, but he's got to be seen to be defeated by his own people, so that they identify the privations they've had to go through with his actions. And we didn't do that.
I think what we should have insisted upon is Saddam Hussein come to Safwan. That was our mistake, because that allowed him to blame his generals for the defeat and not he himself.
Saddam Hussein now moved forces loyal to him from Baghdad to suppress the uprisings in the south. American troops could see the fighting from their positions, but they were ordered not to intervene.
My advice to the president throughout the period of this uprising is that this did not seem to me to be an operation that we needed to get involved in, because I couldn't figure out who was doing what to whom. And it would have required us to move further into Iraq and take responsibility for that part of Iraq and for a purpose that was not stated.
And that was the quagmire. Therein laid Vietnam as far as we were concerned, because we would still be there. And what's more, given the American way of doing things, we would have then had the responsibility for rebuilding all of the infrastructure. And we were just determined not to get sucked into that trap.
Inside Iraq, as each rebel village and town fell, there were terrible reprisals. These pictures, filmed by the Iraqis themselves, would not reach the West for 2 years. They show Shia prisoners and senior officers from the Iraqi regime. There are estimates that tens of thousands of Shias were killed.
The Americans did not interfere. Therefore, it took us only a few days to recover from the surprise, to reorganize our troops, reorganize our resources, and impose peace and order in the southern governors. It took us 2 weeks to do that.
Just a few miles away, 500,000 coalition troops began to leave Iraq. After months in the desert, they were returning home. The Allies still hoped one of Saddam's generals would overthrow him, but the ill-fated uprising had caused the Iraqi military to rally around Saddam out of fear of something worse. The White House had miscalculated. Meanwhile, the Iraqi leader had his part of the bargain to keep.
Round about March 3rd or 4th, this gray-haired gentleman opens up my cell door and says, "Do you need anything?" I said, well, at this point in time, I said, yes, I could use a couple blankets. I would like some shoes. I hadn't had any shoes. I was wearing yellow POW pajamas now that didn't fit, So I started asking for stuff. I figured I better ask now. I may not get anything ever again. No one's ever asked me if I needed anything. So I started asking for stuff, and he says, "Don't worry, you won't need any of that. You'll be leaving. You'll be going home in 15 minutes.
And around there were hundreds of reporters. And that's really quite overwhelming. I mean, you've just been in solitary. And I think that's really when you thought, well, I probably am released. But I still didn't reckon I was not a prisoner of war until I was out of Iraq.
And then the pilot announces, we're in Saudi Arabian airspace, and everybody starts shouting and high-fiving each other, and a Brit Tornado comes up and joins up and rocks his wings, and we can see the guy out the windows, and we're waving, and he's waving back at us, and it was just joyful.
And we landed in Riyadh, and I saw all these people, and I thought, my God, what's this all about? As I started walking down the stairs, I realized that this really is for us. And my wingman was there to meet me, and he was overjoyed, obviously, to see me. I was overjoyed to see him. It's the first time that I had actually expressed any real emotion since being beaten.
I've spent very little of the war worried about whether or not I was female. It just didn't seem to matter. But I didn't want anyone to think that I was weaker or more emotionally vulnerable or anything like that when I got back. And I have to say that when they sing that song, I'm proud to be an American, I always well up. It's kind of like when they play taps or something. And so I played the song over my mind several times, and I even had...
Trying to convince anybody what the realities of war are like is very difficult. Not just my situation. If you've been shot at or in combat and seen friends die, you see it in the films, but you don't smell it, you don't hear it, and you don't see grown men cry, and you don't see what it's like to see real people hurt. And you can never put it in words when you return either.
Now there was a second uprising in Iraq, this time in the Kurdish north. Saddam had used chemical weapons to suppress previous revolts, but the Kurds sensed weakness. The secret police headquarters in Sulaymaniyah was one of the regime's nerve centers. For years, Kurdish guerrillas had fought for independence. Now they united with mutinous troops and attacked. The men inside resisted desperately. They knew there was much to avenge. As night fell, the gates were stormed. A Kurdish teenager educated in Britain was there. He'd heard President Bush on the radio.
When George Bush said that he would back up a people's revolution in Iraq, then they thought, that's all we need. That's all we wanted to hear, so they just did it.
In the south, the uprisings had been incoherent, but the Kurdish uprising was different. The Kurds had political leaders who could give the revolt shape. As the rebellion gathered momentum, these Kurdish leaders who'd been living abroad began to return. They wanted to trigger a coup against Saddam. They hoped a new Iraqi leader would let the Kurds run their own affairs. Traveling with them was an American, an observer from the United States Senate.
At that point, everything hung in the balance. Had the United States signaled its support for the uprising, I am convinced it would have succeeded. There were Iraqi generals who were, in fact, in touch with the opposition and who were sitting on the fence waiting to see what would happen. And when the United States did nothing, said nothing, sat on its hands, of course, they took the course of caution.
That very night, Saddam Hussein's troops attacked. Washington had decided it did not want to support an uprising that might lead to the breakup of Iraq. The rebel forces fought back, but they were hopelessly outgunned. The Kurdish leaders who'd encouraged the revolt had made a terrible miscalculation. As shells began landing on the cities, there was panic. Not only were the casualties heavy, but they feared a chemical attack at any moment.
I do not want to push American forces beyond our mandate. And we've done the heavy lifting. Our kids perform with superior courage, and they don't need to be thrust into a war that's been going on for years.
The Iraqi forces advanced relentlessly, and the cities of Kurdistan emptied before them. Now, 1 million people were on the move. They headed for the mountains, trying to reach the safety of the Turkish and Iranian borders.
When George Bush said that he didn't want the American military interfering in this, the Kurds got scared. We heard the shelling and the bombing, and our next door neighbor came around and he said, look, you've heard what people are saying about the Iraqis. I think it'd be, wise of us just to leave Sulaimania. So my dad agreed and said, okay, we'll leave.
It reminded me of refugees leaving Paris in June 1940, just ahead of the German army. Everybody knew of George Bush's call for them to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein, and they all had exactly one question: why isn't Bush helping us?
The American pilots patrolling the skies above Iraq could see the Kurds being chased into the mountains, but they had strict orders not to intervene.
We saw helicopters chasing a lot of people down a road, and we saw the gunships shooting at them. You could see the smoke coming out of the gunship and occasionally see flashes of the tracers, even though the sun had just started coming up.
Saddam Hussein bombing, bomba, helicopters destroyed us. I don't know. They saw this, but they don't know why. We are human like you.
We felt frustrated in the fact that we couldn't help the uprising that was going on the ground for whatever political reasons that were above our rank. And the best we could do is report what we saw and eventually hope that it was taken care of.
The only issue that came up is, should we do something about the Iraqi helicopters? It had never been one of our objectives to get involved in this kind of civil uprising between factions within Iraq and the Iraqi government. And so it was not clear what purpose would have been achieved by getting ourselves mixed up in the middle of that.
A week after the Iraqis attacked the Kurds, the president went home to Houston to celebrate his victory. But the television images of the Kurdish exodus were making that victory ring hollow. The president asked James Baker to see how the situation could be diffused.
We did not want to take on the responsibility for having to create a safe haven there. And if it was going to be enforced, it wasn't going to be enforced by others. It was going to have to be enforced by Uncle Whiskers, and we really didn't want to do it.
Baker's aides suggested a visit to the Kurds.
As we were flying along, we all of a sudden saw a whole sea of people camped out in the mountains, and this was early spring when it was quite cold. We landed there, and then we took four-wheel drive vehicles up the mountain. There were 50 to 75,000 people in this little valley. Every piece of ground had a little tent or a makeshift shelter on it, and they'd cut down all the trees for firewood. And they were drinking out of the mountain streams, and some were barefooted.
Baker was able to spend only 7 minutes on the ground before security men hustled him away. But he saw and heard enough to be sure this was not just a humanitarian nightmare. It also had the potential to become a political disaster.
I called the president from the airplane and told him I'd never seen anything like this, and that a lot of people were going to die if we didn't do something and do something quickly, and that he needed to really break whatever China was required in order to get it done.
I have directed the U.S. military to begin immediately to establish several encampments in northern Iraq where relief supplies for these refugees will be made available in large quantities.
Once the safe havens were established, the Iraqis backed off, raising questions about how much suffering could have been avoided if decisive action had been taken earlier. 5 years later, the havens are still there, protected by American air power. The men who planned the war feared what they called a ragged ending, a quagmire like Vietnam, or a stalemate like Korea. They had been completely surprised by what actually happened. 2 rebellions, brutally suppressed by an Iraqi military which threw in its lot with a humiliated Saddam and kept him in power. This was a ragged ending no one had seen coming. Two weeks after the liberation, the Emir of Kuwait returned to his country. The Allies had fought a war for Kuwait and its oil, and against the tyranny of Saddam, but the promises of a greater democracy in Kuwait would come to little. On the streets, the priority was revenge. Hundreds of Kuwaitis had died during the occupation, and now vigilantes picked up suspected collaborators on the flimsiest of evidence. The PLO leader Yasser Arafat had supported Saddam Hussein, and now all Palestinians were under suspicion. Many were tortured. Hundreds disappeared. And 400,000 were eventually driven out of the country. But for the American military, its stunning victory over the Iraqis and over its own demons seemed complete.
I was just thinking as I sat in the stands watching Norm and the guys walk by, this is incredible. We have come a far piece from the early 1970s when we came home to a state of being ignored. We had come a long way to rebuild the armed forces of the United States.
I was in Vietnam twice, and I couldn't help but just think to myself, this is the right way to come home to your country. And it tended to exorcise a lot of ghosts and a lot of wounds that all of us who were in Vietnam carried with us.
After it was all over, my wife and I walked over to the Vietnam Memorial and talked to some of the Vietnam veterans who were there. And I said to them, hey, this one's for you too.
If the victory in the Gulf buried America's Vietnam syndrome, it also resurrected war as a means of achieving national objectives. And it demonstrated that America's generals would again have a tremendous influence on how those wars would be fought.
The war showed that Colin Powell is an enormously conservative man who is reluctant to use military force as an active instrument of foreign policy and diplomacy. The war, as it unfolded, was in keeping with his concept of what warfare should be, and the so-called Powell Doctrine, with an objective in getting in very quickly with overwhelming force if you have to use that force, but reluctant to use it in the first instance. But if you use it in a big way, and then pack your bags and come home. That's exactly the way the war was fought, because he was the major influence on the decision-making process. And he has to share the glory of what was good about the war, and he must also share some of the burden of where things did not work out exactly as they should have.
We can grind our teeth forever as to whether we should have fought a day or two longer. We can grind our teeth forever as to who was for sanctions, who wasn't. But we ought to recognize a significant achievement that Desert Shield, Desert Storm was. President Bush said, this will not stand. That did not stand.
In retrospect, I think it's clear that Bush rose above the limitations of character and vision for the first time, and as it turned out, the only time in his presidency, to become a really extraordinary man.
I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over. Because the world would not look the other way, Ambassador El Saba, tonight, Kuwait is free. Where is it?
George Bush's vision of the New World Order was that countries could unite in common purpose for the benefit of all mankind. But it wasn't World War II. It's hard to argue that he was Franklin Roosevelt.
And this I promise you, for all that Saddam has done to his own people, to the Kuwaitis, and to the entire world, Saddam and those around him are accountable.
By demonizing Saddam, Bush, in fact, planted the seeds of discontent in the country, in the same way that Lieutenant George Bush in 1945 would have felt dissatisfied had the real Adolf Hitler still been in power in Berlin and the Japanese warlords still been in power in Tokyo.
May God bless this great nation, the United States of America. Thank you all very, very much.
Despite his enormous popularity at that moment, 2 years later, Bush would be decisively defeated for re-election. Saddam Hussein's survival seemed to emphasize the American recession and Bush's timid domestic agenda. Saddam's got his job, read one bumper sticker. How about you?
He performed after the war in ways that, in many ways, were entirely predictable. Bush came back to earth when the war ended, and there Bush, I think, will remain.
Saddam Hussein is still in power, still claiming that his survival was his victory. But his invasion of Kuwait had turned to dust, and his dreams of dominating the Middle East have vanished. The Gulf War left the Iraqi armed forces broken. UN teams are still dismantling its nuclear and biological weapons programs, and sanctions cripple the economy. But Saddam is still defiant.
There is the aggressor, Saddam Hussein, still in power. There is the President of the United States, no longer in power. There is the Prime Minister of Britain, who did quite a lot to get things there, no longer in power. I wonder who won.
We did. We did. As long as we are alert and observant, Saddam Hussein is not a threat to his neighbors. He's a nuisance, he's an annoyance, but he's not a threat. That we achieved.
And I can also tell you that in due course, Saddam Hussein will not be there. And when that happens, all this interesting second-guessing will seem quite irrelevant.
It took 7 months to extinguish the oil wells which burned across the battlefield. The war changed the balance of power in the Middle East and ignited the peace process between Israel and its Arab neighbors. But with time, its promise as the herald of a new world unity that would confront the moral outrages of our time has faded.
I think that the notion that the Gulf War was being fought for a new world order was in fact intended to obscure the fact that it was being fought for very much the old world order. Cheap petroleum, benign monarchies. There was no new world order that came out of the Persian Gulf War. In fact, I think that's proven to be mostly a pipe dream since then.
To learn more about the Gulf War, visit Frontline on the World Wide Web at the PBS homepage at this address. You'll find an interactive online supplement there, an extensive oral history of the war,
agreed with the president saying,
and more first-hand accounts from airmen and soldiers.
They kept asking, well, where were you from? Where were you flying? What was your target?
Find out more about the weapons and technology used for the first time. And then please give us your feedback. It's all at the internet address on your screen. Off the net, you can tell us what you think about our programs by fax at 617-254-0243 or by snail mail at this address. And next time.
You either love him or you hate him.
Brash. He certainly thinks of himself as the general.
A self-proclaimed revolutionary.
Very capable.
The best thing that happened in this country in a long time.
You wouldn't trust him any further than you can throw him.
This Don Quixote, the impossible dream.
The leading practitioner of the Washington influence money game.
I am a genuine revolutionary.
The Long March of Newt Gingrich. Next time on Frontline.
Funding for Frontline is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you. Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content.
You can order The Gulf War on home video cassette by calling 1-800-255-9424. This 4-hour series is $39.95 plus shipping and handling.
This is PBS. For a printed transcript of this or any Frontline program, please write to this address: Journal Graphics Incorporated, 1535 Grant Street, Denver, Colorado, 80203. To order by credit card, call 303-831-9000.